The teapot on the stove was still steaming when Walter and Evelyn Hensley vanished from the agricultural community of Chariton, Iowa, population 4,982. The night of October 11, 1984 passed in the damp chill of a Midwestern autumn, with thin mist blanketing the freshly harvested cornfields. At 9:47 p.m., their neighbor, Mrs. Ruth Delgado, could still see the kitchen light spilling through the window as Evelyn stood by the sink, and Marla, their only daughter, moved around the dining table. Walter was sitting near the window, where the old radio steadily broadcast the late-night cold front forecast. The elderly woman clearly remembered the last silhouette passing behind the curtain before the lights suddenly went out, and the house fell into absolute silence. What happened in the following 47 minutes would haunt Chariton for more than 2 decades afterward. Before diving deeper into the story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell so you don't miss the latest cases. In October 1984, the town of Chariton in Lucas County, Iowa, still maintained the slow, characteristic pace of a Midwestern farming community. Endless cornfields stretching out, the steady hum of grain dryers during harvest season, gravel roads leading to sparsely spaced farmhouses where any small change in routine was easily noticed. In that stable setting, the Hensley family lived on the eastern edge of town, where their 2-story wooden house overlooked more than 10 acres of cornfields. The father, Walter Hensley, 63 years old, was a longtime farm owner, known in the area for his punctuality and discipline. He always woke before 5 in the morning, checked the irrigation system, then headed to the barn to prepare for the day's work. His wife, Evelyn Hensley, 58 years old, handled the bookkeeping, tracked seasonal expenses, and maintained the household routine. Every morning, she brewed coffee before Walter returned from the barn. Those habits rarely changed. On the evening of October 11th, the last people to see the Hensley couple all confirmed that family activities were proceeding normally. Neighbors saw the kitchen light still on around 9:30. The housekeeper left the house shortly before 9 o'clock and noticed nothing unusual. Their daughter Marla, 32 years old, said her parents had gone to bed earlier than usual after a long workday. None of them reported any signs of stress or disruption in routine. The next morning, October 12th, the familiar morning rhythm did not occur. No sound of the barn door opening, no aroma of coffee drifting from the kitchen. Marla woke up and noticed the unusually prolonged silence. She walked through the rooms of the house, the master bedroom, dining room, kitchen, but could not find her parents. Their coats were still hanging in their usual places. The truck remained in the garage, and no belongings appeared to be missing, as if they had left on their own. At first Marla called out, thinking they might be in the backyard or barn, but there was no response. After several minutes of searching the entire house without finding any signs of activity, the worry in Marla quickly turned to panic. Realizing the silence was not normal, she left the house, walked to the nearest neighbor in a state of confusion, asked them to help check, and requested they call the police to report her parents missing. The missing persons report was made from the neighbor's phone and transferred to the Lucas County Sheriff's Office switchboard around 7:20 a.m. Within minutes of receiving the information, an initial response unit consisting of 2 patrol officers was dispatched to the Hensley farm address to make contact with the scene. En route, they received preliminary details: 2 adults missing from their residence, circumstances unknown, no signs of having left the home. When the patrol car stopped at the gravel driveway leading to the house, the officers immediately noted the quiet surroundings, no unfamiliar vehicles parked nearby, no unusual movement marks on the dew-damp soil. They approached Marla and the neighbors waiting on the front porch and requested that the reporting person be separated to gather. In the quick intake, the officers focused on key points: the last time Marla saw her parents in the house, the time she discovered they were gone, the condition of doors and windows when she checked, and whether anyone else had visited or contacted the family the previous evening. This information was recorded in the initial missing persons report to establish the most accurate timeline possible. After completing the preliminary interview, the officers asked non-essential persons to move back to the outer yard to avoid disturbing the scene observation. A basic perimeter was established, from the front porch to the garage and extending to the backyard area near the barn. They used temporary marking tape, not because they suspected a crime, but to ensure all exterior details around the house remained undisturbed during verification. The two patrol officers began checking the perimeter, following the path from the house to the backyard, using flashlights to sweep along the foundation for any signs of scuff marks, unfamiliar footprints, or dropped items. There were no suspicious signs. The ground was flat, with no fresh footprints other than those made by Marla and the neighbors that morning. The garage entrance was closed. The family truck inadvertently became a significant factor, as its presence in the garage indicated a low likelihood that the victims had left by vehicle. The officers recorded this detail as an important element in constructing possible disappearance scenarios. Next, they observed the windows around the house, paying attention to potential entry points that could have been forced open. No windows showed pry marks, scratches, or fresh damage. This intact condition made the officers more cautious in their assessment. The exterior showed no evidence of the victims leaving on their own or of forced entry. Before entering the interior, they reconfirmed with Marla that from the time she discovered her parents missing until she asked the neighbors to call police, no one else had entered the house except her. When Marla confirmed this, the response team immediately noted the official time of scene contact to clearly establish the chain of custody. Entry into the house was conducted cautiously. The goal at this stage was not to search for evidence of a crime, but to verify whether a medical emergency, accident, or other urgent situation had occurred inside, while documenting all observations in their original sequence without altering the existing environment. This procedure reflected standard response protocol for missing persons cases in Iowa in the early 1980s. A time when criminal assumptions were not immediately made, but every observed detail needed to be preserved in case the case later developed in a more complex direction. When the door was opened, the officers entered with the sole objective of documenting the scene in its static state. They began in the living room, where all items appeared to be in their familiar positions: armchairs undisturbed, side table showing no impact marks, and a thin layer of dust on wooden surfaces, indicating no unusual activity overnight. They noted the absence of unfamiliar footprints on the floor, no scattered items, furniture not overturned, and the dim living room lamp remained on, consistent with the family's nightly habit. From the living room, they moved to the dining room, where the previous night's dinner appeared to have been fully cleared. No dishes remained on the table, no pots left unfinished, and no signs of disruption during the meal. Chairs were neatly aligned, tablecloth smooth. The kitchen was recorded in similar condition. Cooking utensils had been washed and put away. The sink showed no food residue. The electric stove was completely off. This reinforced the assessment that the previous evening, the family had concluded their routine as usual, with no unusual activity after the housekeeper left. Next, the officers checked entry doors and potential external access points. The front door was locked from the inside, the deadbolt intact. The back door was in similar condition, with no scratches, breaks, or pry marks. Window panes were unbroken, wood trim undisturbed, rubber seals intact, indicating no force applied. The side door, the one the family commonly used, was also closely inspected. The lock operated normally, with no tool marks. All windows were documented as closed and showing no signs of movement since the previous night. The fact that all access points remained intact led to the preliminary conclusion that there had been no external intrusion. On the first floor, the officers continued searching for signs that the victims might have left in an emergency, but found no clothing pulled down, no personal items missing. Both husband and wife's everyday coats and shoes were fully accounted for. Notably, they recorded that the truck keys were still hanging on the hook next to the kitchen door, exactly where the family usually kept them. When they moved to the second floor, the officers examined the master bedroom. The bed was neatly made with covers undisturbed, as if no one had left in a hurry. The alarm clock on the nightstand was stopped at the previous night's shutdown time. No clothing had been selected and discarded. The closet showed no missing items according to Marla's assessment. The adjacent small dressing room also had no fallen items or signs of searching. They continued to the second room, believed to be Evelyn's activity space. Everything in the room was in its proper place. The ledger book on the desk, reading glasses beside it, nothing suggesting a struggle. The upstairs bathroom was clean, with no wet towels or abandoned personal items. The entire second floor showed no signs of fighting, no hurried departure, and no evidence of a third party present during the night. After inspecting all main living areas, the officers marked several locations for deeper examination in the next evaluation phase. The side door area, the hallway leading to the back door, and the spot near the laundry room where the wood floor showed faint scuffing of unknown origin. Additionally, they noted the need for a thorough check of the garage and barn at an appropriate time. Upon completing their notes, the officers determined that the interior of the house showed no signs indicating the victims had left voluntarily or that any struggle had occurred. The scene stood eerily still, as though both individuals had simply vanished without leaving any physical impact on their living environment. After completing the interior survey, the police shifted to establishing the first search perimeter around the yard and pathways surrounding the house. Viewing this as the next step to determine whether there were any signs the victims had left the house toward the outer areas, they employed a concentric circle radius method, starting from the front porch and expanding outward to the front yard, backyard, and paths leading to the garage and barn. Each segment was marked with temporary stakes and divided along natural lines to ensure no overlapping areas were missed. The initial sweep focused on the ground, which still retained the characteristic early October Midwestern dew that readily preserves footprints or fresh tire tracks. However, upon close inspection of the packed dirt path from the porch to the yard gate, the officers found no unfamiliar footprints or deep impressions, only those clearly made by Marla and the neighbors that morning. Based on soil compaction and direction of travel, they noted that if two adults had left the house during the night, the damp soil would very likely have retained prints. From the front path, the search team moved to the rear area, where a gentle slope led down to the barn. This was the most suspicious area within close range because the softer dirt could more easily preserve footprints, but continuous section-by-section inspection revealed no fresh shoe impressions. No soil edges were disturbed. No drag marks or sliding traces. Closer to the backyard, officers swept along the wooden fence line to check for any bent, broken, or scratched sections, suggesting someone had climbed over during the night, but the entire fence frame remained intact. A few meters away, they inspected areas typically used for stacking firewood and placing metal bins to determine whether any items had been disturbed while someone moved outward, but the arrangement there remained stable with no recent disturbance. The survey team also paid attention to the adjacent field to the east of the house, where a small footpath used by the family led toward the cornfield. This route offered a possible shortcut for the victims to leave, but even here the softer soil showed no suspicious traces. No large or small shoe prints, no unusual dragging marks. Low branches along the path were not broken, indicating no adult had passed through during the night. Another team checked the side yard beside the garage, where the ground was covered with gravel, making tire tracks easy to spot. But no tracks were present except the family's fixed parking marks. No new vehicle entry or exit. During the sweep, officers also looked for items that might have been dropped: handkerchiefs, wallets, papers, objects fallen during movement, but found no such evidence. The roadside mailbox was checked to rule out the possibility the victims had gone out at night to retrieve mail. Nothing appeared recently disturbed. Upon completing the close radius search, the officers compiled all findings: no human footprints, no tire tracks, no dropped items, no disturbance to vegetation or soil. This led to the preliminary conclusion that within the immediate vicinity of the house, there were no signs indicating Walter or Evelyn had left via the surrounding dirt paths during the night or early morning. nor any evidence that anyone else had approached the area from the outside. After completing the close-range sweep, the police moved to the early witness statement collection phase to reconstruct activities leading up to the disappearance and establish verifiable timelines. The first witness interviewed was Ruth Delgado, the housekeeper, who had left the house on the evening of October 11th. Ruth stated she finished work around 8:50 after dinner had been cleared and the Hensley couple was preparing to rest. According to her, Walter was reviewing the seasonal ledger at that time, while Evelyn was tidying the kitchen, with no signs of anxiety or stress. Ruth affirmed that both spoke to her in normal tones before she left. Neither mentioned going out or any special plans. She also said she heard no loud noises or arguments while present. When asked about house activity after she left, Ruth only recalled that the dining room light was still on as she stepped down the porch, and when she reached the gate, she saw kitchen light reflecting through the window. After Ruth's statement, the officers spoke with the neighboring couple, who lived one large yard away from the Hensley house. They reported that around 9:30 p.m., they could see the Hensley kitchen and living room lights still on, which matched Ruth's account. One of the neighbors added that when they checked the chicken coop around 9:45, they heard no unusual sounds coming from the Hensley house or the rear property. However, the other neighbor recalled that around 10:30, the living room light went off, but the first floor hallway light remained on. This light-out time was not mentioned by Ruth, as she had left nearly an hour earlier. The police recorded this as an important time marker, since it established the last observed change in household activity after the housekeeper departed. When combining these statements, several points of consistency were reinforced: the time Ruth left, the kitchen light remaining on after 9 o'clock, and the lack of notable activity around 10 p.m. Nevertheless, the officers also noted some timelines that did not fully align. Specifically, the 10:30 living room light going out per the neighbor remained unclear as to who turned it off and whether this occurred before or after the occupants went to bed. Additionally, one neighbor recalled seeing a figure move past the kitchen window around 9:40, but they were unsure whether it was Walter or Evelyn, and noted no clear action. This detail could not yet be verified, but was included in the report for later cross-reference. When compiling the information, the police created a timeline list with 3 main markers: 8:50, Ruth leaves the house; 9:30, lights still on; and house quiet; 10:30, partial lights off. These 3 points created an unexplained gap lasting over an hour, from 9:30 to 10:30, during which no direct witness observed the interior of the house. This could have been the window in which the critical event occurred. With the data from the first group of witnesses still too limited to form a complete timeline, the police quickly summarized all information and compiled a list of additional individuals to be interviewed next. This list included households within earshot of any loud noises from the Hensley farm, people who might have passed the main road between 9 o'clock and 11 p.m. All were incorporated into the next phase work plan, with the goal of narrowing the critical time window and ruling out the possibility that the 2 victims had left voluntarily or had contact with outsiders prior to their disappearance. From this list, the police prioritize approaching the witness most directly related to the last moment the Hensley couple was seen: Gordon Pike, Walter's brother-in-law. He was the one who came for dinner and left the house before the family began their evening routine, making his statement a key to determining the condition of the 2 victims during their final hours and reconstructing the sequence of activities right before they disappeared. The interview took place at his home on the morning of the same day, while the crime scene was still being processed. Gordon stated that he visited Walter and Evelyn around 6:15 p.m., following his occasional habit of stopping by whenever he passed through Chariton on a freight delivery run. He described the evening as completely normal. Evelyn prepared a simple meal consisting of cold cuts, bread, and leftover salad from the previous day. Walter talked throughout the meal about the upcoming corn harvest and some expenses that needed to be monitored. According to Gordon, neither spouse showed any signs of stress, and he did not notice any arguments or disagreements during the time he was there. When questioned more closely about their actions before he left, Gordon recalled that Evelyn was cleaning up the kitchen while Walter stood reviewing paperwork on the dining table, possibly the season ledger or bills needing notes. After finishing his cup of tea, Gordon left the house around 8:15 p.m., a few minutes later than he had planned. And according to him, at that moment both victims were still going about their normal activities. Evelyn was closing the kitchen cabinets while Walter checked the side door lock, a daily habit of his. When asked if he heard or saw anything unusual as he was leaving, Gordon hesitated for a moment before answering that as he stepped off the porch and walked down the final steps. He heard a faint sound from inside the house, like the sound of feet shifting or something sliding across the floor. He was not sure which room the sound came from. It was very brief, and not loud enough to make him turn back to check. However, he had the impression that it was not a sound caused by Evelyn, because at that moment he had just seen her in the kitchen area, and the noise seemed to come from the hallway leading toward the laundry room. The police noted this as an important point, because previous statements from Ruth and the neighbors made no mention of any activity after 9 p.m. Yet Gordon's account indicates movement inside the house immediately after he left. When directly asked about the family atmosphere, Gordon was reserved, but ultimately admitted that recently Walter had mentioned increasing financial pressure in the farming operation, and Evelyn wanted to adjust some expenses that Walter did not fully agree with. However, he insisted that there were no signs of tension during the evening he visited. When the police probed further about the relationship between Marla and her parents, Gordon said he did not involve himself much in his relatives' family matters, but knew that there were sometimes disagreements, particularly regarding the division of farm work time and responsibility for Evelyn's care. He did not witness any direct arguments that evening, but acknowledged that over the past few months, he had sensed a low-level tension within the family, even though it was not openly apparent during his visits. Another detail Gordon recalled was that as he walked to his vehicle, he glanced through the kitchen window and saw the light reflecting in a way that made him think Evelyn was still standing in the kitchen area, but he did not see Walter within view from the window. The fact that Gordon did not see Walter in that moment does not prove anything definitive, but the police recorded this information as a small piece in reconstructing the positions of family members in the house after someone had left. When the police asked more about the sound he heard, Gordon explained that it resembled the noise of someone changing direction while walking or lightly dragging something across the wooden floor. Because of its brevity and lack of follow-up sound, he did not think it was important at the time, but now, knowing the two people were missing, he believed the detail might be significant. He affirmed that he saw no strangers around the property as he left. The gravel road was quiet, with no vehicles coming or going from the direction of town. The interview concluded with the police recording 3 key points. Gordon left the house at 8:15 p.m. At that time, both Walter and Evelyn were carrying on normally, and immediately after he stepped outside, a sound of undetermined origin occurred inside the house. These data points were entered into the report as critical markers for narrowing the timeline and suggesting the possible existence of internal conflict. Even though Gordon did not directly witness any argument or altercation, when cross-referencing all statements collected from Ruth Delgado, the neighboring households, and Gordon Pike, the police began constructing an official timeline to determine the last period when the two victims were seen, while also clarifying the segments of time that no witness had verified. This piecing together became a crucial step in the initial investigation structure, as each matching or discrepant time marker could point to movement, the victim's final behavior, or unusual activities that occurred that night. The police started with the earliest time marker involving a direct witness, approximately 6:15 p.m., when Gordon arrived at the Hensley home. From that point until he left at 8:15 p.m., all 3 people present were confirmed to be engaged in normal activities. Dinner was prepared and finished. Evelyn cleaned the kitchen. Walter reviewed the record book. During the period from 6:15 to 8:15, no unusual signs were noted, no loud noises, no strangers observed in the area. This became the first stable phase in the timeline. The next confirmed marker was 8:50 p.m. When Ruth Delgado left the house. She confirmed that both Walter and Evelyn were still awake, engaged in their usual routine, and showed no signs of preparing to leave. The kitchen and dining room lights were still on as Ruth went down the stairs and out into the yard. From 8:15 to 8:50, the overlap between Ruth's and Gordon's statements allowed police to mark this as the last period when the two victims were seen by household members and relatives in a normal state. However, immediately after the 8:50 mark, the timeline began to show multiple gaps in data. The next witness-provided time marker came from a neighbor who saw the kitchen and living room lights still on around 9:30 p.m. This event created an important confirmation point. At least until 9:30, there was no indication of disruption or sudden change in the family's routine. However, no witness directly observed Walter or Evelyn at that time. The only information concerned the lighting inside the house, not the state of the people. This forced the police to mark 8:50 to 9:30 as the period of stable house condition, but no direct confirmation of victims, an important but data-insufficient interval. The 9:40 p.m. marker was provided by another neighbor who reported seeing a figure pass by the kitchen window, but could not identify who it was. Police had to enter this detail into the timeline as witness unable to identify, meaning it could not be used to confirm the victims were alive at that point. Nevertheless, it still held value in establishing that there was movement in the house nearly 50 minutes after Ruth left. Investigators marked this point as an unverified identity activity to be cross-checked later. The next significant time marker was 10:30 p.m. when a neighbor observed the living room light go off while the first-floor hallway light remained on. Police viewed this as the first sign of a change in routine that might relate to the moment the victims ceased normal activity. From 9:30 to 10:30, no direct witness confirmed the location or state of Walter and Evelyn. This became the single most critical gap in the entire timeline, the 1-hour behavioral void that police identified. When incorporating Gordon's statement into the overall timeline, police added another important point immediately after the 8:15 mark. That is, the unusual sound he heard as he left the porch. The sound came from the hallway area, described as similar to something sliding or short footsteps. Although the sound itself proves nothing definitive, it created a small marker indicating movement inside the house right after the last non-family member departed. From this, police were able to construct a sequence of confirmed points and unverified points. Confirmed points include 6:15 p.m., Gordon arrives, 8:15 p.m., Gordon leaves, 8:50 p.m., Ruth leaves, 9:30 p.m. Kitchen light still on, 10:30 p.m. Living room light turned off. Unverified points include activity after 8:50, unidentified movement at 9:40, event leading to living room light being turned off at 10:30. The two victims not appearing again after 8:50. Police began marking the time segments needing verification through future search and forensic efforts. The hallway area where Gordon heard the sound, the kitchen and rear window area related to the 9:40 figure, the location of the living room light switch to determine if the light was deliberately turned off, and the entire first floor, since no witness confirmed any activity after the 8:50 mark. The timeline was recorded in the investigation report as a dynamic document to be updated with additional data, but at the completion of this stage, it clearly showed that the last period when the two victims were definitely still alive fell between 8:15 and 8:50 p.m., while establishing a critical gap from 9:30 to 10:30 as the time segment requiring priority for deeper investigative measures. Based on the newly established timeline and the lack of clear traces in the immediate vicinity, the police proceeded to the first expanded search within a 1-mile radius around the Hensley home, using a structured search pattern to ensure no potentially relevant natural area was overlooked in relation to the two victims' disappearance. The plan was divided into 4 main directions based on terrain: the creek line to the southeast, the path leading to the cornfield to the west, the dense grass and low brush along the northern fence line, and the small trail heading toward the gravel road connecting to the county road. The search team was divided into small units, each responsible for one direction, moving in parallel in straight lines or fan formations, depending on the width of the area. Along the creek line, the first group conducted a sweep along the water's edge for approximately 300 meters. Since the water here was only ankle deep and the creek bed consisted of loose rock mixed with mud, signs such as footprints, dropped items, or disturbed vegetation were likely to be detectable if anyone had passed through during the night. However, after nearly an hour of searching, police recorded no fresh human footprints in the mud, only small animal tracks, mostly raccoon and cottontail rabbit. No scraps of fabric, papers, or personal items were left behind. The transitional area between the creek and the path into the cornfield was also thoroughly swept, but no signs of recent human passage were found. The second group was responsible for checking the western path which Walter commonly used to access the farther parts of the cornfield. This route had soft soil, with many sections capable of retaining footprints or drag marks if someone had moved while carrying something heavy. However, all existing tracks were old and worn and did not match the time frame of October 11th. The few small vehicle tracks discovered matched those Walter had made in the preceding days, based on the familiar tire pattern Marla confirmed. Police examined dozens of meters along the path, carefully inspecting both edges for broken branches or flattened grass, but still found nothing new. The third group was deployed to the dense grass and brush area along the northern fence, a location rarely visited and easily capable of serving as a temporary hiding spot for evidence if someone had left the house during the night. This team used probing sticks to separate patches of grass in search of dropped items or disturbed ground. They checked knee-high grass patches and small patches of soil interspersed with brush, but everything appeared consistent with stable weather conditions over many consecutive days. No human footprints were found, no disturbed soil or bent bushes. At the wooden fence line extending toward the dirt road, police checked the condition of fence posts and connecting wires. No section was bent or broken, indicating no one had crossed the area recently. The final group examined the trail connecting the house to the main gravel road. This was the route most likely to be taken by anyone walking away from the house at night. The team used a parallel three-person sweep to observe both ground traces and any dropped items that might blend into grass or gravel. The road surface was primarily compacted crushed stone, so fresh footprints would typically displace stones or alter compaction. However, aside from morning tracks left by police and neighbors, no footprints consistent with the time of disappearance were found. The crushed stone showed no recent disturbance. The road edges had no flattened or dragged grass. Police extended the search a few dozen meters toward the main road to rule out the possibility that the victims followed a larger roadway, but the results remained unchanged. Throughout the entire search process, all teams simultaneously looked for signs of personal items such as wallets, handkerchiefs, scraps of fabric, notes, sharp objects, or anything that might indicate a departure from the house, but nothing was recovered. No dropped items, no foreign objects on the ground, no abandoned bags or clothing. When the teams returned to the staging point to compile data, police concluded that within the 1-mile expanded search radius around the house, there was no evidence whatsoever indicating that the two victims had moved out of the area on foot. No footprints, no drag marks, no disturbed vegetation, and no physical evidence left behind. This conclusion reinforced the assessment that if the two victims had left the house or been taken away, it did not occur along any natural route around the property, and the departure from the area left no surface traces. After completing an extended search around the property, but finding no signs of movement whatsoever, the police shifted their focus to the farm's outbuildings, particularly the barn and silo, as these were the two structures most directly tied to Walter's daily activities, and also places where traces could potentially be hidden without being easily detected from the outside. The barn was located more than 30 meters from the main house. The ground leading into this area showed signs of long-term use, but no recent disturbance. The police approached the barn from the main south-facing door, where the hinges were slightly worn, but the door remained firmly closed, with no signs of being broken or pried open. Inside the barn, the police immediately noted that the structure consisted of three main areas: the agricultural equipment storage zone, the materials stacking area, and the earthen floor section, where the family typically kept tools, fertilizer, and various seasonal items. Natural light filtering through gaps in the tin roof clearly revealed a uniform layer of dust on the rafters, indicating that many parts of the barn had seen little activity in recent times. The inspection team moved from left to right along a fixed path to ensure no overlap or omissions. All machinery, such as the small tractor, hand carts, and storage drums, remained in stable positions, showing no signs of sudden movement or use during the previous night. In the scattered tool area, the wooden crates and burlap sacks were undisturbed, and the ropes hanging on hooks were neither untied nor tangled, indicating no significant recent activity. However, when they reached the western earthen floor section, a roughly square area, measuring about 2.5 meters on each side, the police noticed a clear difference compared to the rest of the floor. Here, the soil had a different color and compactness than the surrounding ground. Instead of being tightly compacted and uniform like the areas that had borne the weight of machinery for months, this patch appeared looser, with an uneven surface structure, and the edges showed a slight curvature, as though the soil had been dug up and then roughly leveled again. Using a manual probing rod, a long metal tool designed to test soil compaction, the police tested multiple points and recorded compaction levels approximately 15–20% lower than the long accumulated soil in the surrounding areas. There were no large voids or obvious sinkage, but the rebound feel from the probe indicated the soil had been disturbed more recently than the rest of the barn floor. Since this patch was in a location with no particular functional purpose, the discrepancy was considered a point of interest. After identifying the sign of soil disturbance, the police began measuring and precisely marking the suspect area for inclusion in the scene diagram. They used a tape measure to record the dimensions of the two sides to establish a basic coordinate frame, approximately 2.4 meters along the width of the barn and 2.7 meters along the length. A fixed reference point was set at the base of the western wooden post, from which a reference triangle was drawn to allow the location to be re-established in the future without relying on visual estimation. The boundaries of the disturbed area were outlined with chalk and marked at all four corners. The police also took overall and close-up photographs, including shots of the probing rod inserted at points of abnormal compaction as supporting evidence. At the same time, they documented the surrounding physical conditions: no broken brick fragments, no foreign objects stuck in the soil, no sweeping or dragging marks on the surface. Nevertheless, the consistent difference in soil structure across a defined area was sufficient for them to place it on the priority inspection list. To ensure comprehensive information, they also checked beneath the floor, but this barn had a direct earth floor with no raised structure, so no void space existed underneath. They additionally inspected the silo, a cylindrical structure used for storing grain, but found only a small amount of leftover corn at the bottom and no accessible entry points that would make it suspicious. Since the silo had only one iron door with a lock showing no signs of tampering, police quickly eliminated it from the initial list of suspects. Returning to the barn, the police continued examining items around the suspect soil area. They inspected fertilizer sacks, wooden crates, and shovels, attempting to determine whether any tools had been used recently. Several shovels were covered in thick dust, with clean edges showing no fresh soil or new cracks, indicating they had not been used for many days, possibly weeks. No direct evidence suggested the soil disturbance resulted from routine agricultural activity. After nearly an hour of survey, the police concluded that the western earthen floor area of the barn showed signs of prior intervention, but under 1984 investigative standards, they lacked sufficient grounds to proceed with deeper excavation or structural dismantling of the barn, as no additional supporting evidence existed. Moreover, excavating the floor at that point could damage the barn and would be difficult to justify without compelling cause. Therefore, they tagged the area for ongoing monitoring and comparison with any new leads that might emerge. At the conclusion of the survey phase, police designated the barn as a location requiring special observation during the investigation. However, at this stage, the disturbed soil patch was recorded only as a potential lead rather than an actionable crime scene. After completing the initial barn survey and finding insufficient grounds for further intervention, the police returned to synthesizing all data collected from the static scene, witness statements, and search results in order to construct three basic disappearance hypotheses and cross-reference each with the established timeline. The first hypothesis, that the two victims left the house voluntarily, was examined first as the simplest logical possibility. However, comparison with scene evidence revealed numerous contradictions. Both the front and back doors were locked from the inside. Walter's and Evelyn's coats, shoes, and car keys remained in their usual places. No footprints, drag marks, or any disturbance were found on the ground around the house, and no witnesses saw them leave the property at any time within the window from the previous evening through the following morning. The timeline also failed to support this hypothesis, as the last confirmed direct sighting of them occurred before 8:50, and from then until 10:30, no evidence indicated they had left the house. All these factors made the voluntary departure hypothesis highly unconvincing, especially given the victims' consistent habits. They had never left home without at least minimal personal items. The second hypothesis, that the two victims were taken away by someone, was considered next. This scenario would require an approach to the property without creating noise, without leaving tire tracks, and without being noticed by neighbors over a fairly wide time window. However, the 1-mile radius sweep around the house showed no fresh tire marks on the gravel driveway leading to the farm, no drag marks or signs of heavy objects being moved, and no tampering with the fence or secondary access points. The timeline also did not support undetected external access. Neighbors reported no unusual vehicle sounds, no strange lights, and the entire area remained quiet from 9:30 to 10:30. Removing two adults from the house without leaving any surface traces was judged extremely unlikely, given the property's terrain. The possibility of the victims being removed by other means could only be reconsidered with new data, as the current timeline, scene and search results provided no supporting evidence. The third hypothesis, that the perpetrator was inside the house, was analyzed most thoroughly because the minimal disturbance inside the residence greatly reduced the likelihood of external intervention. In this scenario, the disappearance occurred entirely within the family's internal sphere, explaining the absence of external traces. The timeline created a gap from 9:30 to 10:30. Long enough for internal action without outside witnesses. The noise Gordon reported shortly after 8:15 could fit some form of internal household movement, though it could not be considered establishing evidence. Notably, the static scene showed no signs of struggle, no overturned furniture, and no clear physical indicators, which limited this hypothesis since it failed to explain the complete lack of fighting evidence. Additionally, while the barn contained a disturbed soil area, this detail currently lacks sufficient basis to directly link to any hypothesis, and police had to note that although the possibility of internal intervention remained open, supporting evidence had not yet emerged. When the three hypotheses were placed side by side and compared against the timeline and scene data, police determined that none stood out or possessed strong enough evidence to become the primary investigative direction. Voluntary departure contradicted the scene, abduction contradicted the search results, and an inside perpetrator contradicted the lack of clear physical signs. The absence of any reinforced hypothesis forced police to acknowledge that the investigation had reached a temporary standstill and further progress would require additional evidence, whether from the scene, physical items, or supplementary statements, to narrow the analysis and eliminate unsuitable possibilities. After finalizing the analysis of the three disappearance hypotheses and recognizing the lack of supporting data for any direction, the police refocused on statements from the last people present in the house, with Marla playing a pivotal role as the first to discover her parents' unusual absence. The initial interview with Marla aimed to precisely establish the timeline of when she woke, slept, and checked the house on the night of October 11th, while reconstructing her movements during the period potentially related to the victim's disappearance. At the start of the interview, police asked Marla to describe the previous evening in detail. According to her, after the housekeeper left around 8:50, she tidied the dining table a little, and then went upstairs to rest. She stated she could not recall exactly when she turned off the light in her own room, but estimated around 9:15. However, when cross-referenced with the neighbor's report that the living room light remained on until 9:30, police noted that Marla's time frame might be inaccurate or incomplete, since if she had turned off the living room light before going to bed, the timing should match the neighbor's observation. When specifically asked whether she came back downstairs after going to her room, Marla appeared uncertain, saying she thought not, but then added that she might have gone down for water, though she did not remember clearly. Police noted this ambiguity and flagged it as the first point requiring verification in her timeline. When asked to describe her movements after going upstairs, Marla said she read for a while and then went to sleep, but could not provide a clear time for when she fell asleep. The inability to pinpoint this moment made it difficult for police to place her behavior within the established timeline. Another issue arose when police asked whether she had heard any noises in the house from the time the housekeeper left until she fell asleep. Initially, Marla said she heard nothing, but on the second asking, she vaguely recalled possibly hearing wind or light movement downstairs. This inconsistency drew attention because it related to Gordon's statement about hearing a noise when he left the porch around 8:15. Although the times did not match, the possibility of minor activity in the house, while no direct witnesses were present, needed consideration. Continuing the interview, police asked whether she had gone back downstairs before fully going to sleep. Marla answered that she didn't think so, but then said it could have happened if she forgot to lock the back door. When asked whether she had checked the back door that evening, Marla replied she did not remember. This created another potential time frame during which she might have moved around the house without recording it in her statement. Each small detail like this forced police to consider the possibility that Marla's timeline contained omitted or inaccurate segments. Another noteworthy point was the timing of when Marla said she went to sleep. If she slept around 9:30 as initially stated, the fact that neighbors saw the living room light turned off at 10:30 implied the light was extinguished either by someone else or by Marla herself after the time she claimed to have been asleep. When police asked whether she was accustomed to waking up in the middle of the night to go downstairs and turn off lights or check doors, Marla said not regularly, but did not rule out that she might have done so that night. This constituted the third inconsistency in her statement. Her reported sleep time did not align with the observed light extinguishing time. Police then moved to questions about the following morning. Marla stated she woke around 6 a.m., went downstairs, and found the house unusually quiet. However, she could not clearly confirm whether she had heard her parents at any point before leaving her room. This left the victim's status between 9:30 p.m. and 6 a.m. the next morning completely without direct data from anyone living in the house. When asked to describe the last time she saw Walter and Evelyn, Marla reiterated that it was when they said goodnight before she went upstairs. However, police noted that this statement did not fully align with the time Gordon left, because if everyone was preparing for bed before 9 o'clock, the living room light remaining on until 9:30 required explanation. When synthesizing all of Marla's responses, police identified at least 4 gaps in her statement: the exact time she went upstairs, whether she returned to the first floor afterward, the actual time she fell asleep, and who turned off the living room light at 10:30. These inconsistent time points made Marla's personal timeline a segment of data requiring high verification, forcing police to classify her statement as information whose reliability could not yet be confirmed, while clearly marking the gaps that needed supplementation through independent investigation. After completing the first interview with Marla and noting numerous gaps in her statement, police decided to conduct a second expanded search, this time focusing on the cornfield located west of the farm, a much larger area than the previous 1-mile radius search. Since this was land Walter cultivated annually, with soft soil that would readily retain traces if anyone passed through at night, police considered it a location requiring a structured grid search to ensure comprehensive coverage. The search team was divided into 4 groups, each responsible for one segment of the field, marked with wooden stakes in horizontal and vertical rows to form uniform squares approximately 20 meters on each side. This spacing was appropriate for manual search in terrain with limited visibility due to tall corn stalks. The groups moved parallel along each row, with members spaced 1.5 to 2 meters apart to simultaneously observe both the ground surface and the lower stalk zones. They searched for evidence items such as scraps of fabric, cord, purses, personal belongings, as well as movement traces such as trampled grass, disturbed soil, broken stalks, or unusual gaps in the rows. In the first segment, near the path leading from the backyard to the field, the search team recorded completely dry soil with no drag marks or fresh footprints. Corn stalks in this area were in normal condition, with no leaning in the direction of human passage. A few stalks were broken at ankle height, but these were determined to be natural breaks or caused by small animals, not human force. In the second segment, deeper into the field, the team began carefully examining the soil between the rows, where footprints would leave clear compression marks if anyone had passed through. However, multiple observation points showed uniform compaction consistent with prior agricultural machinery used rather than new footprints. The flat horizon of the soil also showed no signs of temporary burial or dragging. While moving through the 4th row of this area, a volunteer spotted a darker soil streak, but upon close inspection, it was merely a patch of retained moisture due to dense corn shade, not a dug or disturbed area. The third segment, near the western edge, was the most difficult to observe because sunlight reached unevenly, and the corn grew more densely. Yet the team maintained the grid structure. They searched for dropped items, handkerchiefs, buttons, notes, matchboxes, things that could fall out if the victims or someone else had moved through hurriedly. However, no foreign objects were found. The corn stalk stood perfectly upright, with no signs of being swept aside, almost certainly indicating no adult had passed through this area during the night or early morning. In the final segment, bordering the dirt road on the western side of the field, police focused on tire tracks, as this could be a feasible route for anyone attempting to approach the farm via a back way. However, the soil at the road's edge was dry and level, showing only old agricultural truck tire marks, with no unfamiliar tires or fresh tracks from the night. The team also extended a few meters into the adjacent boundary land to ensure no small evidence items had been blown out by wind, but the area was completely clear. After nearly 3 hours of sweeping the entire large area, police summarized the results: no human footprints, no drag marks in the soil, no corn stalks broken by impact, no new tire tracks, and no personal belongings of any kind found in the area. The entire surface was uniform and showed no section disturbed within the time frame from the evening of October 11th to the morning of October 12th. The official conclusion of the second expanded search stated that the cornfield contained no evidence indicating the victims had passed through, been taken through, or that any related items were present. Based on the terrain characteristics and the completely negative grid sweep results, the cornfield was classified as an area with minimal likelihood of connection to the victim's departure from the house. While conducting a thorough check of the backyard area to ensure no transitional spaces between the main house and the field were overlooked, the search team responsible for the southern line discovered another unusual detail related to a metal burn barrel located about 15 meters from the house. This was a typical trash-burning barrel commonly used on many Iowa farms, consisting of an old steel drum perforated around the body to allow airflow. Burning paper, dry grass, or other easily combustible materials was routine, but when one team member looked inside the barrel, he noticed that the ash layer at the bottom was not uniform like ash from household trash. This ash layer was dark gray mixed with patches of unburned black material, including clumps of ash that had fused into harder than normal forms. These anomalies prompted the search team to immediately report the finding to the police in charge of the scene. When police approached the burn barrel, they examined it more closely and observed that the ash layer did not consist solely of paper or wood ash, but appeared to contain signs of synthetic materials that had been burned at high temperature, forming darker patches with a slight sheen. The presence of a mixture of different materials in the ash was a red flag requiring investigation, because if any items had been destroyed on the night of October 11th, there was a high likelihood they would leave traces in the burn barrel. Since forensic procedures in 1984 were not as advanced as in later decades, police had to collect samples manually, but followed strict evidence preservation protocols to avoid damaging or losing critical information. They first used a metal rod to gently stir the ash layer to determine whether any larger items remained intact, while also checking for sharp objects or easily identifiable metal pieces. During this process, they discovered a small partially burned piece of fabric, approximately 3 to 4 centimeters in size. The color was no longer clear, but the exposed fiber structure indicated it was not the type of material typically used for routine trash burning. Nearby, they found a small metal fragment resembling a button or clasp, deformed and discolored due to heat exposure. At the bottom of the barrel, a fingernail-sized piece of polymer was also discovered, possibly the remnant of a burned item. Each of these objects was documented and placed into collection trays. 1984 protocols required police to use paper bags or cloth bags to prevent moisture condensation that plastic bags often cause, and samples were not to be mixed together. Therefore, the fabric fragment, metal piece and polymer fragment were separated and placed into 3 different bags, each labeled with a code number, collection time, collector's name, and precise location within the barrel. The remaining ash was collected into a metal container to preserve its properties for potential future analysis. Police also measured the depth of the ash layer, a detail that helped determine whether the burning occurred close to the time of the disappearance or was residue from earlier burns. The thick ash layer suggested the barrel may have been used 1 or more times recently, but visual observation alone could not pinpoint the exact timing. The entire area surrounding the burn barrel was also searched for related signs of activity, such as scattered ash outside, dropped items or footprints around the barrel. However, the ground here was relatively hard and showed no fresh shoe prints or drag marks. This made it difficult for police to determine who had used the barrel recently and when. Upon completing sample collection, police documented each location on the scene diagram, measuring distances from the barrel to the house, to the barn, and to the fence to establish spatial correlations. Close-up and overall photographs were taken according to procedure. After preparing the report, they transported the evidence in a specialized vehicle to be stored in a dry environment, protected from direct light. However, due to the technical limitations of forensic analysis in 1984, they could not immediately determine the chemical nature of the polymer fragment or identify the fabric fiber type. These items were recorded only as potential evidence that might or might not be related to the disappearance and could only be definitively verified with more advanced analysis later. Nevertheless, the discovery of partially burned materials represented a significant step forward in the investigation, as they were the first physical traces potentially carrying information about activities that took place the night before Walter and Evelyn were reported missing. The discovery of unusual ash forced police to add the burn barrel to the list of areas requiring closer examination and subsequent investigative steps, although at this point, they had no basis to link it to any specific hypothesis. After compiling all collected data from witness statements, close-range and extended searches, barn survey, to the discovery of ash in the burn barrel and notable gaps in the timeline, police entered the formal cross-referencing phase to identify inconsistencies between statements and physical evidence. This was a critical step in the investigation, because once sufficient information accumulated, discrepancies and inconsistencies began to emerge clearly, particularly in the statements of the three key witnesses, Marla, Ruth, and Gordon. First, police compared Ruth's and Gordon's accounts of the victim's condition before they left the house. Both agreed that Walter and Evelyn were behaving normally with no signs of stress or disturbance. However, when comparing departure times, Gordon left at 8:15, while Ruth left at 8:50, a 35-minute window during which only Ruth remained in the house with the victims. This detail alone was not problematic, but when combined with the timeline provided by Marla, police began noticing significant discrepancies. Marla stated that she went upstairs to her bedroom around 9:15, but neighbors confirmed that the living room and kitchen lights remained on until 9:30, raising the question, who maintained or changed the lighting in the house during the time Marla claimed she had already withdrawn to her room. If Marla did not come back downstairs after 9:15 as she stated, then the lights still being on at 9:30 must have been controlled by someone else. But Ruth had already left at 8:50 and Gordon at 8:15, meaning neither of the two direct witnesses could explain this match. Next, police compared Marla's statement that she heard no unusual sounds after coming downstairs with Gordon's account of hearing a brief sound resembling footsteps or something sliding across the wooden floor shortly after he left the porch. This difference created a significant area of disagreement. If there was activity in the house immediately after 8:15, Marla should have heard it if she was downstairs at that time. Yet she insisted she heard nothing. When questioned further, she said she might have heard wind or slight movement, but was unsure. The change in her description of the sound indicated instability in Marla's statement, while Gordon's remained consistent and direct. Another issue concerned the 10:30 mark, when a neighbor saw the living room lights go out. According to Marla, she had been asleep before 9:30, or at least had withdrawn to her room and not come back down. Yet the living room lights were turned off more than an hour later. If Marla did not turn them off, the question became, who did? If it was Walter or Evelyn, that conflicted with the entire disappearance timeline because no one saw them after 8:50. Meanwhile, police found no evidence of any stranger approaching the house. The fence was undisturbed, doors showed no signs of forced entry, and the ground had no fresh footprints. This made the light extinguishing time one of the most contradictory points in the timeline. In parallel with the statements, the extended search around the house, cornfield, and creek area revealed no signs of departure or dragging. The ground was undisturbed, vegetation was not trampled, and no items were scattered. This further supported the conclusion that the two victims did not leave the house voluntarily in any natural direction and were not removed through conventional routes. The interior crime scene also provided no clear information, no signs of struggle, no overturned or broken objects, no indications of major movement. The absolute stillness of the scene made it difficult for police to establish any scenario involving the departure of two adults. Although the barn had an area of unusually disturbed soil, it yielded no specific conclusion because no items indicated fresh digging that night. The disturbance could have resulted from prior agricultural activity, and while the degree of soil looseness was suspicious, police lacked data to treat it as evidence. Finally, the discovery of the burn barrel containing unusual ash and three forms of partially burned materials, fabric, metal, and polymer, was recorded as evidence. But there was no analytical capability at the time to determine whether they were related to the victims or simply household waste. Due to the lack of 1984-era forensic technology, these were considered points of interest rather than evidence. When cross-referencing all data, police began noting prominent inconsistencies between Marla's statements and the behaviors described by Ruth and Gordon. Ruth described a peaceful house with lights on and the two victims acting normally. Gordon heard a strange sound right after 8:15. Neighbors saw lights on at 9:30 and off at 10:30. Marla was unable to clearly explain the activities during that exact period and provided several inconsistent time points. The combined contradictions led police, for the first time, to consider the possibility that someone within the family might be involved, as all peripheral evidence ruled out the possibility of an outsider approaching without leaving traces. However, even though the inconsistencies suggested Marla's statements were unreliable, police had no physical evidence proving a crime had occurred in the house, let alone any indication that the two victims had died. No blood, no signs of struggle, no direct physical evidence, no witness to abnormal behavior. All data pointed only to the possibility that someone knew more than they had disclosed, but not strongly enough to charge anyone or focus the investigation on a clear suspect. This left the case in a state of impasse. There were suspicious indicators and statement inconsistencies, but absolutely no concrete evidence to confirm that a crime had occurred or to assign responsibility to anyone. After many weeks of continuous investigation without any breakthrough, the Lucas County Sheriff's Office was forced to face the reality that the missing persons case of Walter and Evelyn Hensley had reached the limit of exploitable information in 1984. All peripheral investigative leads were ruled out due to the lack of traces of departure from the house. Natural access routes, such as the creek, paths, and cornfield, showed no signs of movement. The barn's disturbed soil provided no grounds for expanded excavation. The burn barrel's unusual contents lacked sufficiently powerful analysis methods to establish legal value. Witness statements were contradictory, but none clear enough to be considered perjury. There were no signs of struggle, no physical evidence, no witness seeing the victims leave or being taken, and no matching missing persons reports from neighboring counties. The physical condition of the scene offered no support for any specific hypothesis. Everything remained in the gray zone of data absence. In internal meetings at the end of December 1984, the entire investigative team agreed that they had checked every possible location without causing structural damage or exceeding technical authority. Further interviews yielded no new information. Key witnesses repeated their original statements. Marla made no significant changes to details despite the many gaps in her account. After comprehensive review, the investigation commander concluded there was no longer justification to continue deploying personnel on the previous scale. Maintaining the case in active status without a viable investigative direction was deemed inefficient and beyond the resources allocated for prolonged missing persons cases. Ultimately, the case was classified as missing persons, unresolved, meaning there was no evidence confirming death, no data confirming voluntary departure, and no provable indication of criminal activity. This classification was reserved for missing persons cases lacking sufficient information to shift to a criminal investigation, but also unable to be concluded as voluntary departure. The decision to close the case was issued in early January 1985. A summary report was prepared, clearly stating the status of the investigation at closure: location of the victims unknown, manner of disappearance undetermined, no identified suspects. The file was archived in the sheriff's office storage, along with other long-term missing persons cases in Lucas County. From that point, the case was no longer under active investigation and would only be revisited if new information was provided by the public. Immediately after this decision, participating units were withdrawn from the scene. Community volunteer searches also gradually dwindled as time passed without progress. The silence of the scene, the absence of new leads, and the failure to reconstruct the victim's final movements caused the Hensley disappearance to close as a mysterious void in the 1984 records. The case was officially closed with the notation, "No further investigative direction, awaiting additional information." In the mid-1990s to early 2000s, when the Iowa Division of Criminal Investigation began developing a periodic review program for unsolved cases statewide, the Hensley missing persons file emerged as one of many old cases needing reevaluation. Each year, DCI received lists of stalled cases from county levels, then prioritized them according to new criteria, including file completeness, preservation status of potential evidence, and degree of initial statement inconsistency. When reviewing cases from the 1975-1985 period, DCI's analysis team noted that most long-term missing persons cases had very limited information, but the Hensley file had several features that prevented it from being eliminated in the first round. A rich quantity of initial statements, a relatively clear timeline, a stable crime scene, and especially the presence of sealed physical evidence, the burned barrel ash, partially burned fabric, fragment, deformed metal piece, and polymer sample. These factors led the archivist to mark the file with the label potential for reanalysis if technology permits. By 2006, when DCI launched a statewide data unification project and catalog of cases potentially solvable with modern forensics, they applied a solvability potential evaluation system with 7 main criteria. When applied to the Hensley case, it received a surprisingly high score: contradictions among statements of 3 core witnesses, a static but not crime-excluding scene, preserved burned evidence in storage, and a timeline containing significant untested gaps. The final evaluation placed the Hensley case in the high solvability potential group, accounting for only about 12% of unsolved cases statewide. Immediately following this assessment, DCI officially accepted the file from Lucas County Sheriff's Office. The 1984 documents were transferred to the Central Archive, including scene diagrams, barn sketches, search reports, all statements, and complete evidence collection records. Most importantly, DCI re-inspected the contents of the evidence container to determine preservation status. Because the ash and burned fragments had been packaged according to 1984 standards in paper bags and metal cans, most of the evidence remained intact, with no severe degradation. The technical team noted this as the key factor making the case viable. If there had been no physical evidence, the chance of resolution would have been near zero. In the first inspection, DCI technicians opened each sealed sample in the presence of investigators, recorded the process, and digitized the documentation before performing any further handling. The ash sample was transferred to clean glass jars for stable temperature storage. The fabric fragment was flattened and placed in new protective bags, and the metal and polymer pieces were photographed under magnification to record surface structure. Each item was assigned a new DCI identification code, while retaining the original reference numbers to ensure chain of custody traceability. When the analysis team reread the 1984 reports, they paid particular attention to 3 suspicious points: the undisturbed excavated soil in the barn, the burn barrel containing a material mixture inconsistent with household trash, and the contradictions among Marla, Ruth, and Gordon's statements regarding lights on, lights off, and house activities from 8:50 to 10:30. These 3 factors, combined with the preserved evidence, led DCI to conclude that the Hensley disappearance was not simply a case of lost contact or voluntary departure, but exhibited characteristics of a disappearance with suspicious circumstances, a classification that could open the door to investigating criminal conduct. Although no in-depth analysis had yet been conducted, the re-evaluation was sufficient for DCI to place the Hensley case on the list of files to be reopened at the preliminary investigation level. This marked the first time since 1984 that the disappearance of Walter and Evelyn Hensley was considered potentially solvable thanks to advances in forensics and the preservation of the partially burned evidence. After completing the acceptance process, DCI officially listed the file as opened under preliminary review, initiating a new investigative phase based on modern technology and procedures that the 1984 investigation could not implement. Right after DCI officially received the case file and reviewed all evidence seized in 1984, the DCI forensic team moved into the in-depth analysis phase, focusing on 3 main samples: the partially burned fabric fragment, the deformed polymer piece, and the ash collected from the bottom of the incinerator. Thanks to 2007 technology far surpassing the analytical capabilities available at the time of the original incident, the forensic team was able to employ testing methods that the 1984 investigators could not perform. The partially burned fabric fragment underwent fiber analysis using polarizing light microscopy combined with FTIR spectroscopy. Under high magnification microscopy, the fiber structure gradually became clear, This was not ordinary cotton fabric from cleaning rags or household cloths, but rather tightly woven twill-patterned fibers, typically used for fall jackets or lightweight protective coats. Infrared spectroscopy analysis produced results matching polyester wool blend fibers, a material quite uncommon in everyday rural life, but consistent with women's cold weather coats for middle-aged women. The forensic team immediately cross-referenced this conclusion with notes in the 1984 file regarding Evelyn Hensley's everyday clothing, which mentioned that she owned a light brown polyester wool blend coat of simple design, but described as quite thick and specifically used for cool October evenings. When comparing the fiber structure of the incinerator fabric fragment with photographs of Evelyn's coat preserved in the file, the analysis team observed near-perfect correspondence, the same degree of yarn twist, the same weaving method, and the same high polyester-to-wool ratio. DCI recorded this as a legally significant finding because it was the first time a burned piece of evidence was credibly linked to an item belonging to one of the two victims. Nevertheless, the forensic team conducted one additional verification using Raman spectroscopy to ensure certainty. The results continued to confirm that the partially burned fabric was highly likely from a type of fabric used in women's coats, compatible with the description of the coat Evelyn frequently wore. After completing fiber analysis, the team moved on to the polymer sample. The burned polymer fragment was subjected to DSC scanning and molecular structure analysis. Results showed that the polymer was not from large household appliances, but rather a thin polymer commonly found in personal items such as eyeglass cases, plastic wallet clasps, cream jar lids, or small women's accessory components. More notably, the thermal analysis spectrum indicated that this item had been burned at a significantly higher temperature than typical household incineration, proving it was placed into the incinerator while the fire was burning strongly, not merely residual ash from regular trash. This was consistent with the possibility that someone had deliberately introduced small personal items into the incinerator on the night of the mysterious disappearance. To further support this assessment, the forensic team compared the polymer sample against the 1984 inventory of Evelyn's personal belongings. This list included items Evelyn commonly carried: reading glasses, a hard plastic eyeglass case, a women's leather wallet with plastic trim details, and a small makeup compact. Analysis of the polymer characteristics of each listed item revealed that the burned polymer fragment was consistent with the material used in common eyeglass cases of the early 1980s. This expanded the possibility that the burned item was not ordinary trash, but a personal belonging of Evelyn. Meanwhile, the deformed metal fragment was examined using CM scanning electron microscopy. Electron microscope images showed it was not structural metal or equipment debris, but rather a small detail such as a button or clasp. The forensic team compared its shape and metal thickness with standard women's coat accessories from that period, and noted it matched many clasps used for coat pockets or collar edges. Although the degree of burning made absolute identification difficult, its shape remained distinctive enough to consider it related to clothing. DCI recorded that the three pieces of evidence, fabric, polymer, and metal, though small, together, formed a combination consistent with an article of clothing or personal items belonging to a victim, and their presence in the incinerator at the time of the disappearance significantly increased suspicion. The overall conclusion from the 2007 forensic analysis was the fabric fragment was most likely from Evelyn's coat. The metal fragment was consistent with women's clothing hardware. The deformed polymer came from a small item Evelyn commonly used, and all had been burned at temperatures higher than typical household waste incineration. While these findings were not sufficient to identify a perpetrator, they were strong enough to prove that the incinerator evidence was not domestic trash, but items directly related to one of the two victims, thereby opening a new direction for the subsequent investigation. When the analysis results from the incinerator evidence showed a direct connection to the victim's belongings, DCI shifted focus to the only area in the entire 1984 crime scene that had been noted as anomalous but lacking sufficient grounds for excavation at the time: the western section of the barn floor. The differing soil compaction in that area had been documented since the disappearance, but in 1984, there was neither the technology nor sufficient legal basis to intervene. In 2007, using modern soil forensics standards, DCI implemented systematic soil examination through core sampling to determine whether that section of floor had been disturbed around the time of the disappearance. The procedure involved drilling soil cores at 3 aligned points and 2 perpendicular points, forming a cross pattern covering the entire suspected area previously marked in the old file. Each core was drilled to depths between 20 and 60 centimeters, sufficient to penetrate the naturally accumulated layers over many years. The very first core extracted immediately revealed anomalies instead of continuous vertically compacted layers, characteristic of a long-established barn floor. The core from the suspect area showed disrupted stratification, with the surface layer heavily disturbed, the middle layer containing inconsistent mixed patches, and the bottom layer lacking its natural boundary. The soil forensics team compared the suspect area core with a control core taken from a normal barn area approximately 2 meters away. In the control sample, the layering was clear. A tightly compacted top silt layer from agricultural machinery activity, a stable subclay layer, followed by a natural loose layer. In contrast, the suspect area core showed a high porosity surface layer with many sharp-edged soil particles, typical signs of excavation and refilling. Laser granulometry particle size analysis revealed an abnormally elevated proportion of fine particles compared to the control, indicating mechanical disturbance relatively close to the 1984 sampling period. Technicians also noted the presence of decomposed organic material out of natural cycle, specifically young root fragments mixed deep in the middle layer, an illogical finding because roots only grow in upper layers unless the soil has been disturbed. This is a classic indicator of an area that was deeply dug and then refilled within a short time frame. The analysis team further examined soil bulk density. The original barn floor had stable density due to years of compaction by machinery and seasonal materials. However, samples from the suspect area showed 18–22% lower density, consistent with the initial 1984 description of soil that was looser and inconsistent. Plotting density profiles by depth for each core, the soil forensics team observed that the density curves in the suspect layers did not follow natural patterns. In undisturbed samples, density increased steadily from top to bottom. In the suspect samples, density fluctuated anomalously at 3 points, creating a profile characteristic of soil that had been cut open and unevenly recompacted. Notably, at approximately 40 centimeters depth, the sample showed mixing of 2 differently colored soils, a lighter brown upper layer and a darker brown lower layer that had been inverted and blended. For soil forensics specialists, this was significant evidence, as the field and barn of Walter Hensley featured consistent layering. Such mixing could not occur without physical intervention. The team continued chemical analysis of the soil samples, testing phosphate and nitrate levels, 2 indicators that can change with fertilizer use or agricultural activity. Both indicators were low in the suspect area, in complete contrast to the rest of the barn, which had been subjected to years of farming impact. This suggested the suspect point was not a regularly farmed area, but one disturbed only once in a short period. Combining this with the original 1984 file, the soil examination team determined that this disturbance very likely coincided with the victim's disappearance time frame. By cross-referencing estimated soil moisture using TDR methods with NOAA weather data from 1984, DCI found that the suspect soil sample exhibited compaction characteristics corresponding to weather conditions around early October 1984. During analysis, the soil forensics team also noted that the disturbed soil area closely matched the zone manually marked by 1984 police. The disrupted soil structure did not match the original barn floor compaction pattern and could not be attributed to routine activity, indicating a digging and refilling process occurred within a relatively short time frame around the disappearance. The final conclusion of the soil examination phase confirmed that the disturbed barn floor area was not a natural phenomenon or the result of farming activity, but had been excavated and refilled within a time frame consistent with the disappearance. This was the first time since 1984 that scientific evidence demonstrated the barn floor contained legally significant anomalies, and this finding opened an investigative avenue the original file could not pursue. After the soil examination results showed that the barn floor had been dug up and refilled around the time of the disappearance, DCI proceeded to non-invasive testing using ground-penetrating radar, GPR, to determine whether any voids, foreign objects, or structural changes existed beneath the surface that might relate to burial activity. All equipment was brought to the barn on a dry morning to ensure stable soil conductivity and clearer radar signals. The technical team began by mapping the barn floor in a grid pattern, dividing the entire area into 50 centimeters wide cells. GPR was pulled along each cell in both perpendicular directions to generate sufficiently dense intersecting data for imaging. From the very first scans, the equipment screen displayed inconsistent radar reflections, with numerous small curved noise points that were not clear enough to conclude anything. When the device reached the area previously flagged as suspect from soil analysis, the radar response changed abruptly. Stronger reflections formed an anomalous concave signal zone at 40-60 centimeters depth. This concave zone had sharp reflection edges, uniform amplitude, and a shape resembling an artificial void, not a natural cavity, which typically shows diffuse scattering. When technicians increased resolution, the radar signal displayed a semi-elliptical structure, approximately 1.6 meters long and 0.5 meters wide. This shape was incompatible with any natural barn floor feature. In traditional Iowa barns, floors compact evenly over time, producing smooth, flat radar reflections. Here, GPR recorded a double-edged reflection zone, typical of soil that had been excavated and unevenly recompacted. At the lower edge of the void, radar waves bounced back more strongly, indicating the presence of a higher density object, though small in size and not identifiable. The technical team continued scanning perpendicularly to define the three-dimensional boundaries of the anomalous zone. GPR data confirmed the void was located almost exactly at the center of the disturbed floor area. This matched remarkably well with the core sampling results, which showed strong soil disturbance at the same point. When compiling data from all scan lines, the team constructed a depth map of the barn floor. The remaining areas showed uniform, straight, continuous reflections, while the suspect area displayed curved, alternating reflection lines indicating changes in moisture and density. An anomalous signal band appeared at approximately 50 centimeters depth, with sufficiently clear boundaries for DCI to classify it as a burial cavity, a specialized term describing a void likely created by human digging and burial activity. However, GPR could not determine what was inside the void. It only detected the presence of an empty space or abnormally compacted zone. DCI investigators noted that the shape and dimensions of the void were consistent with a large object burial chamber, although it could not be confirmed whether it contained human remains or related items. When comparing the GPR map with the 1984 barn diagram, DCI confirmed the anomalous zone lay precisely within the floor area boundary that police at the time had marked as potentially disturbed. This correspondence reinforced suspicion that the floor had been artificially interfered with either shortly before or shortly after Walter and Evelyn disappeared. The technical team reported that the obtained signal pattern could not result from agricultural activity, as machinery typically affects only the surface and does not create 40-60 centimeters deep voids. It also was not a natural collapse feature, as the barn floor had no pipes, no geological cavities, and no large burrowing animals. DCI recorded that a final conclusion could not be reached using GPR alone, but the existence of an artificial void provided important scientific grounds for considering deeper investigation. The final GPR team report explicitly recommended the barn floor should be evaluated at the invasive examination level because both radar data and soil forensics indicated burial activity. However, they also emphasized that any decision to excavate must be approved by command level, as intervening in the barn floor could damage the structure. DCI concluded that this area was the next investigative priority, as it represented the strongest physical evidence recorded in the entire case file since 1984. After GPR data confirmed the existence of a burial cavity beneath the barn floor, DCI proceeded to reconstruct the entire sequence of movements on the night of October 11, 1984, using specialized 3D simulation software to check the consistency between Marla's statement, the Hensley house structure, and the actual spatial layout of the farm. This technical reconstruction used the house floor plan, room dimensions, door locations, light switch positions, distance from house to barn, and integrated timeline data to simulate all possible movements between 8:50 p.m. and 10:30 p.m. The period, identified as the critical activity window of the disappearance. When Marla's statement was input into the simulation, the software reconstructed the time she left the dining room, went upstairs to her bedroom, and went to sleep around 9:15 p.m. as she described. However, when simultaneously incorporating the neighbor-recorded lighting data showing lights still on at 9:30 p.m., the system immediately generated an inconsistency alert. If Marla went upstairs at 9:15 p.m. and did not return to the first floor, no one was present downstairs to turn on or maintain the lights until 9:30 p.m. In the model, this small discrepancy initially appeared as a minor flag, but when adding the lights-off data at 10:30 p.m., the time Marla claimed she never came back downstairs, the software labeled the entire period from 9:15 p.m. to 10:30 p.m. as an inconsistent movement window, meaning the actual house movements did not match the described statement. This 75-minute period, after subtracting times with indirect witnesses, left 47 minutes completely unexplained, based on Marla's account. The system assessed this time frame as sufficient for a person to leave the bedroom, go downstairs, exit the house, and return without creating major noise. When simulating the path from Marla's upstairs bedroom to the kitchen and out the side door, based on the 1984 house diagram, the software calculated the average time to go from the second-floor bedroom to the first floor, open the side door, and walk to the barn at normal walking speed. Results showed a round trip of only 10-14 minutes, depending on speed and pauses. Even if the person carried a heavy object or tried to move silently, the maximum time was approximately 18-20 minutes, still well within the 47-minute unexplained gap. The software then tested alternative movement directions, such as out the front gravel road, to the northern grass area, or toward the creek. All these simulations produced durations under 40 minutes. However, the route toward the barn was the only direction that fully matched both the length of the unexplained time frame and the new forensic evidence from soil forensics and GPR. Investigators continued by simulating activities inside the barn, using 1984 soil disturbance marks and 2007 soil core results. When simulating temporary digging with a small shovel, a type present in the barn, the software calculated that a person could excavate a 40-60 centimeters deep, over 1 meter long pit in approximately 25-30 minutes, assuming loose soil without major root obstruction. This duration corresponded significantly with the remaining portion of the 47-minute gap. When simulating a combined sequence, Marla leaving her room around 9:20-9:25 p.m., going downstairs, turning off some lights, exiting through the side door, reaching the barn, working on the floor, and returning home before 10:30 p.m. Everything fit within the software without time conflicts. More importantly, the model showed that if someone exited through the side door without turning on exterior lights and headed toward the barn, neighbors standing in their yard would not see the movement due to the house structure, fence, and darkness blocking the view. This explained why neighbors reported no unusual activity that night. Furthermore, when the system simulated the noise level of opening the Hensley house side door, It recorded that at low volume this sound would not be audible from the second-floor bedroom if the bedroom door was closed. This raised the possibility that a person could leave the house without waking anyone, if anyone else was actually present at that time. Meanwhile, when inputting Marla's statement that she heard nothing distinct while going to sleep, the software marked this as not directly contradictory, but also incapable of ruling out low-volume movement downstairs. DCI continued testing the simulation by varying small parameters: exact time of living room lights being turned off, hallway light switching, walking speed, and even the possibility of carrying items. In the majority of simulations, the route to the barn remained the most logically consistent direction and aligned with field evidence: reasonable distance, no observation from neighboring houses, sufficient time for digging or floor work, and compatibility with the 2007 soil disturbance evidence. The 3D graphics reconstructing the moment the living room lights went off at 10:30 p.m. showed this could occur either before or after the person returned home. And notably, the software demonstrated that the individual could turn off lights while exiting or re-entering without breaking any overall timeline markers. Conversely, when simulating Marla's original statement step by step exactly as described, going upstairs at 9:15 p.m., not returning to the first floor, and immediately sleeping, the software immediately flagged the entire 9:15 p.m. to 10:30 p.m. timeline as an impossible sequence because the observed light events and external activity could not match the statement. The technical conclusion of the 3D simulation software recorded, there exists a 47-minute movement period unexplained by Marla's statement, and the model found no movement direction consistent with field data except the route leading to the barn. This was the first time since 1984 that the barn floor was not merely suspicious, but became the convergence point of the entire timeline, crime scene, and behavioral simulation data. After the 3D simulation showed the most reasonable movement path leading to the barn, and soil forensics confirmed that the ground in that area had been dug up and refilled at a time coinciding with the disappearance, DCI decided to re-interview Ruth Delgado to clarify details related to the barn area that the 1984 investigation had not explored in depth. The second interview took place at the DCI office in Des Moines, where Ruth, now nearly 2 decades older, was asked to describe again all the images, sounds, and minor details she might have overlooked in her initial statement. At the start of the session, the investigator presented several questions about the barn, but did not reveal the GPR results or soil analysis to avoid memory contamination. Ruth was asked whether she remembered any activity related to the barn area on October 11th or the morning of October 12th. Initially, Ruth only repeated what she had previously stated, that she left the house around 8:50, the meal had already been cleared, and no one in the family mentioned going to the barn. However, when the investigator continued asking about the land area west of the barn, Ruth became more hesitant. She said that in her old memory, that patch of ground used to be quite hard because Walter often placed tools there, but she never paid close attention. When asked to recall the morning of October 12th, right before the police arrived, Ruth frowned and said she was not present at that moment, but had stopped by the house at noon after hearing the news of the Hensleys' disappearance. The investigative team asked whether, when she entered the backyard at that time, she noticed anything unusual. Ruth thought for a longer moment, then said she remembered seeing a small mud mark on the step near the side door, but thought it was from a neighbor's shoe or a police officer's. When the investigator asked her to describe it in more detail, shape, color, degree of wetness, Ruth said the mud mark was darker brown than usual, similar to the color of the soil west of the barn, rather than the color of the soil on the front walkway. This statement particularly caught the investigators' attention. To test the independence of her memory, they followed up. Did she notice whether the soil color in the backyard varied by area? Ruth replied that the soil near the barn was darker and more clumpy, while the soil on the walkway was lighter and sandier. When asked why she knew this, Ruth explained that she had often followed Walter into the barn to hand him rags or put things away, and had noticed this difference while working there. The investigative team continued probing with an open-ended question: did she remember anything else related to that area that she had not thought important in 1984? This time Ruth remained silent longer before saying there was one thing she had never mentioned because she wasn't sure it meant anything. She said that a few days before the disappearance, while cleaning the backyard, she had seen a long streak of soil about 20-25 centimeters on the ground near the barn, as if something had been stabbed down and then pulled up, creating a small scratch mark. She said at the time she thought Walter was trying to reposition some tool, so she didn't pay attention. The investigators continued to cross-reference this information with the soil forensic data without revealing the results. They asked Ruth whether the streak was to the right or left of the barn door. Ruth said it was on the west side, very close to the position that later core sampling identified as the main area of disturbance. Notably, Ruth's memory of the soil characteristics, clumpy, dark brown, not evenly dry, matched the soil forensics team's description that the soil in the dug and refilled area had disrupted grain structure and darker color due to moisture changes during disturbance. When the investigator asked again about the mud mark she saw on October 12, Ruth added that the mark resembled the edge of a shoe, but without a clear tread pattern, as if someone had stepped on the barn area soil and then walked onto the step. This aligned significantly with the soil analysis results, showing that the area had been disturbed and soil had been carried away from the disturbed location. Ruth's recollection of these, albeit small, details helped create a direct link between the dug-up barn floor and activities around the time of the disappearance. Because Ruth's statement was completely independent, not led, and naturally matched scientific data she had no knowledge of, DCI recorded this new information as reliable. It further strengthened the suspicion that the barn was a key location related to the disappearance of Walter and Evelyn, rather than merely incidentally disturbed ground. DCI concluded the interview by noting that Ruth's supplemental statement provided additional solid grounds for evaluating the barn as a potential crime scene, likely containing evidence concealed for over 20 years. After Ruth Delgado's supplemental statement showed significant consistency with soil forensics data and the reconstructed timeline model, DCI moved on to re-interview Gordon Pike for the second time to clarify several inconsistencies between his 1984 statement and the technical data obtained in 2007. The interview took place at the Lucas County office, where Gordon, then in his 60s, was asked to describe again everything he saw and heard on the evening of October 11th, especially the activities inside the Hensley house after he left dinner. The investigator began by asking him to recount the sequence of the meal, the last time he saw Walter and Evelyn, and the time he left the house. Gordon repeated that he left at 8:15, but this time he was asked to describe in greater depth the movements inside the house immediately before and immediately after that moment. He said that after saying goodbye to both husband and wife, he walked out of the kitchen toward the front door, and while stepping down onto the porch, he heard a short sound like footsteps or something heavy being adjusted on the wooden floor. He repeated this detail similarly to 1984, but clarified that the sound did not come from Evelyn's position, because when he left the kitchen, he saw her standing near the sink, while the sound came from deeper in the house, the hallway leading toward the side door. The investigator continued questioning about the period after 8:15, because in his original statement, he had said he did not return to the house after stepping out the door, yet neighbors described changes in house lights after 9:30. To test his memory of kitchen activity, DCI showed him the 1984 room layout sketch. Looking at the diagram, Gordon hesitated before saying, "Maybe I misremembered a small part." He stated that after leaving the dinner table, before saying his final goodbye, he had glanced toward Marla and seen her still standing near the kitchen table, apparently washing glasses or rearranging something. When the investigator probed further about the timing when he saw Marla, Gordon unexpectedly stated that it might have been close to 10 o'clock, because he remembered the sky being considerably darker when he went to his car, unlike 8:15 when there was still faint sunset light in October. This detail completely contradicted his 1984 statement, but Gordon explained that he had been very stressed at the time and might have misrecorded the time. He said it took additional time talking with Walter about crop cost issues, and that conversation may have lasted longer than he originally thought. The investigators did not suggest any specific time, but Gordon himself mentioned the kitchen lighting detail. "I remember the kitchen light was still on when I looked back through the window from the porch, and I think Marla was still there." When asked whether he was certain the person he saw in the kitchen was Marla or Evelyn, Gordon said the figure was shorter than Evelyn, and he believed it was Marla. This prompted the investigator to ask, "Are you sure you're not confusing the moment you left dinner with the moment you last saw Marla?" Gordon replied that in his mind the two moments may have merged into one, because memories of that evening had returned many times over the years and became difficult to separate clearly. However, he had one particular memory. He remembered the kitchen light reflecting more strongly on the glass door compared to when he first left, a detail more consistent with a time closer to 10 o'clock, when the kitchen itself was dark, but house lights were still strong. The investigator asked Gordon to precisely describe the direction he walked when leaving the house to check the line of sight from the yard to the kitchen window. When placing his hand on the corresponding position on the diagram, Gordon correctly indicated the angle that the previous 3D model had determined allowed visibility of someone in the kitchen but not the hallway. This led DCI to ask directly, "If you saw Marla's figure around 10 o'clock, why did you state 8:15 in 1984? Gordon sighed and said he thought that was a reasonable time because he didn't want to admit he stayed too late. He feared it might create the misunderstanding that he had interfered in family matters. When directly asked whether he saw anyone else besides Marla in the kitchen at that time, Gordon said no. The house was quiet, and only the kitchen light spilled out. This detail aligned significantly with the data showing lights still on at 9:30, and Marla's vague statement that she wasn't sure if she went downstairs or not after 9 o'clock. Gordon's adjusted statement also helped resolve a long-standing contradiction. If he left the house closer to 10 o'clock rather than 8:15, the wooden floor sound he heard could have occurred later, coinciding with the 47-minute unexplained gap identified in the timeline. When DCI cross-referenced this new statement with the reconstruction model and soil forensics results, they noted that Gordon's belated memory, though not perfectly precise, still matched objective details: kitchen lights on late activity in the house after 9:30, and Marla's presence downstairs near the time the living room light went out. This caused his original 1984 statement to be regarded as an inaccurate description of timing due to memory error, while the new statement more closely reflected reality. DCI concluded the second interview by recording Gordon as a newly valuable witness because the timing of his last sighting of Marla aligned with multiple forensic data points and the technical timeline, while also reinforcing the assessment that the activities inside the house on the evening of October 11th did not match Marla's own statements. After supplemental statements from Ruth and Gordon significantly narrowed the unclear gaps in the timeline, DCI forwarded the case file to the FBI Behavioral Analysis Unit to build a criminal profile based on body concealment behavior, evidence burning, and choice of body disposal location. The BOU reviewed all data from a behavioral analysis perspective rather than a physical evidence perspective to determine the offender type most consistent with the event pattern. The analysis team began by examining the behavioral characteristics of the person who handled the scene: digging, refilling, using the incinerator, leaving no external traces, knowing which barn spot could be dug without attracting attention, knowing how to turn off lights, and move through the house without making major noise. This is a chain of behavior demonstrating inside knowledge, meaning only someone familiar with the house structure and the victim's daily habits could carry it out smoothly in a short time without mistakes. The BOU noted that if the perpetrator were a stranger, they would not be able to locate the precise spot in the barn to dig without making significant noise or mishandling tools. They also could not predict which rooms had lights on at what times, could not move through the side door without leaving external traces, and could not know exactly when neighbors were still awake to avoid their line of sight from the two surrounding houses. Next, the BOU analyzed the use of the incinerator to destroy the victim's personal items, a behavior typical of an offender attempting to erase traces of the victim's last presence in the house. Burning items related to the victims is usually done by an offender who had a close relationship with them and clearly understood which items existed. A stranger would have difficulty quickly identifying which items needed to be destroyed to conceal the disappearance. The BOU also analyzed the behavior of concealing the bodies under the barn floor. In many homicides committed by acquaintances, the hiding location is typically within an area the offender feels they control, a place they believe others will have difficulty accessing. The barn, a private, separate, rarely visited space, fits this pattern perfectly. A stranger would have no reason to choose the barn. Someone familiar with the family would. Behavioral analysis was further expanded by considering the characteristics of an offender highly likely to handle bodies within the permitted time frame. Digging a 40-60 centimeters pit requires moderate physical strength, but more importantly requires calmness and the ability to work quickly in the dark without being detected. The offender had to believe no one would enter the barn at night and had to know the barn was unlocked and posed no risk of being seen from neighboring houses. These factors fit an offender who was part of the family or present in the house at the time of the disappearance. The BAO also evaluated post-offense behavior. In many cases, offenders closely related to victims often attempt to create a mysterious disappearance scenario by reporting the missing persons without providing a consistent timeline or displaying confusion about timing as part of a strategy to create ambiguity. When cross-referenced with Marla's statement, which contained 47 minutes that could not be reasonably explained, no recollection of going downstairs, no memory of turning off lights, and vague descriptions of when she went to sleep, the BAO flagged these points as inconsistent self-reporting commonly seen in offenders attempting to conceal in-house behavior. Additionally, Gordon's statement about seeing Marla in the kitchen near 10 o'clock coincided with the 10:30 light-out mark, creating post-offense behavior consistent with the pattern of an offender returning to clean up or adjust the scene. The BAO also analyzed potential motivational psychology based on 1984 data, mild financial conflict, stress over caregiving responsibilities, and possible accumulated resentment. Though not considered strong violent motives, these factors were viewed by the BAO as consistent with the domestic elimination model, a type of crime that occurs when a family member wants to eliminate someone they view as a burden or obstacle. Combining all behavioral factors, completely static crime scene, body concealment in the barn, evidence burning, no external traces, match between the barn and 3D simulation, and statement inconsistencies. The BAO concluded that the offender was very highly likely someone inside the house, familiar with the house structure, familiar with the victim's routines, and having unverified operational time. The official BAO report stated, the behavior of body concealment, evidence handling, and scene management indicates the offender was not an outsider. All indicators point to individuals present in the house on the night of October 11th. The level of access, degree of control, and type of scene handling are consistent with a family member. This was the first time since 1984 that a federal agency issued a clear behavioral assessment that the perpetrator was almost certainly not from outside, but was within the Hensley family's living space on the night the two victims disappeared. After receiving the behavioral analysis report from the FBI, BAOE, DCI moved to the phase of consolidating all forensic evidence, witness statements, and technical data collected throughout the reinvestigation to formally establish the primary suspect. This consolidation was conducted in sequence by evidence group to assess whether they all pointed to the same scenario. The first evidence group was fiber forensics, in which the partially burned fabric recovered from the backyard incinerator was identified as matching the material of the jacket Evelyn commonly wore on October evenings. This conclusion not only showed that the evidence was directly related to the victim, but also confirmed that Evelyn's clothing or accessories had been placed in the incinerator very close to the time of the disappearance. This was the first physical evidence proving that the handling of the victim's personal items occurred within the Hensley residence, not in an external area. The second evidence group was soil forensics, where soil cores taken from the barn floor showed strong disruption of layering, abnormal density, and mixing of soil layers inconsistent with natural sequence. Notably, soil moisture analysis combined with NOAA weather data indicated that the soil was recompacted at the beginning of October 1984, the time the two victims disappeared. This eliminated the possibility that the ground was dug and refilled due to agricultural activity and strengthened the suspicion that the barn was the location for processing or concealing evidence related to the disappearance. The third group was GPR scanning, which confirmed the existence of a burial cavity, an artificially shaped void, located exactly at the spot noted as unusual by police in 1984, and matching the area identified by soil forensics as disturbed. The GPR showed a void at a depth of 40-60 centimeters, with reflection characteristics typical of a dug and refilled space, along with a return signal from an object of higher density than soil. Although GPR could not identify the object inside, the existence of the void and the obstruction within it provided a strong connection between on-site data and the suspicion of body concealment. The fourth group was timeline reconstruction, in which 3D simulation software showed that Marla's statement contained 47 minutes that could not be reasonably explained, coinciding with the period when the house still had lights on, yet no witness saw the victims, and also matching a time frame long enough to go to the barn, dig a pit or handle evidence, and return to the house before 10:30. No movement direction other than toward the barn fit all the timing data, neighbors' observation angles, light status, and in-house movement model. The fifth group was revised statements, particularly from Gordon Pike and Ruth Delgado. In his 2007 interview, Gordon admitted he may have left the house much later than the 8:15 he originally stated, and clearly remembered seeing Marla standing in the kitchen near the time he departed, a detail that significantly matched the 9:30 lights still on and 10:30 lights out times. Meanwhile, Ruth independently provided details about the mud mark, consistent with the soil characteristics at the disturbed area, and recalled a soil drag mark a few days before the disappearance. These statements, though delayed, naturally matched forensic data they had no knowledge of. When consolidating all evidence groups, DCI conducted a suspect evaluation matrix based on 25 criteria, including access to the scene, opportunity to commit the crime, level of house structure knowledge, ability to operate in the barn undetected, ability to burn evidence without drawing attention, and degree of inconsistency in statements. The results showed Marla Hensley achieved the highest overall correlation across all criteria. No other individual, even Gordon or Ruth, met the physical access criteria, free time to carry out the actions, knowledge of the incinerator and barn structure, or direct contradictions with light on-off data and simulated timeline. The consolidation report concluded, there is no peripheral evidence indicating a stranger's entry, and all technical evidence converges on the same pattern. One person in the house on the night of October 11th, capable of undetected movement, possibly deliberately or unintentionally misremembering time, and having access to both the barn and incinerator. After completing the consolidation of all investigative data, Iowa DCI officially designated Marla Hensley as the primary suspect in the disappearance of Walter and Evelyn Hensley, the first time since 1984 that an individual has been placed in this position, instead of merely being considered a person of interest. Immediately afterward, DCI began drafting the legal case file to present to the Lucas County Grand Jury, compiling all forensic results, GPR data, soil analysis, 3D simulation, adjusted statements, and FBI BAU behavioral assessment. The file was classified as sufficient basis to consider probable cause, marking the investigation's transition from administrative to formal legal phase. When the preparation was complete, all materials were transferred to the Lucas County Prosecutor's Office to proceed with the presentation before the grand jury in accordance with the regulations for cold case investigations where new evidence has emerged. The presentation session lasted many hours, during which the prosecutor systematically organized and introduced the chain of evidence in logical order to demonstrate that probable cause existed showing that a crime had occurred and that Marla Hensley was the person most likely connected to that act, beginning with a group of physical evidence recovered from the incinerator behind the house. The 2007 forensic report was summarized: fabric fibers matching the type of coat Evelyn used, polymer consistent with the victim's personal items, and all evidence items having been burned at a temperature higher than that used for household trash. The prosecutor emphasized that there was no innocent reason for the victim's belongings to appear in the incinerator at the exact time they went missing. Next, the prosecutor moved to the soil forensics evidence, presenting images of soil cores showing that the barn floor had been excavated and refilled during a period coinciding with the disappearance. Disrupted soil stratification layers, abnormal density, and misplaced organic material were all presented to prove that the area had not been disturbed by natural causes, but was the result of deliberate digging and refilling. Afterward, the GPR data was introduced. The prosecutor displayed radar map images pointing out an anomalous reflection zone at a depth of 40-60 centimeters and describing it as a burial cavity, an artificial void containing a high-density object inside. The prosecutor explained that GPR cannot identify the object itself, but the presence of such a cavity is consistent with a pattern of concealing a body or large evidence. When presenting the timeline reconstruction, the prosecutor used a 3D simulation to illustrate the 47 unexplained minutes in Marla's statement. The simulated imagery, derived from technical data, showed that the only movement pattern consistent with all light activity timestamps was travel from the house to the barn, a location that matched the soil and GPR evidence. An important portion was also presented: the revised 2007 statements from Gordon Pike and Ruth Delgado. The prosecutor explained that these two witnesses did not know the forensic results yet, independently described details that significantly matched the scientific data: mud stains matching the barn soil color, a figure in the kitchen near the time the lights went out at 10:30, and movement inside the house. After 9:30, this independent corroboration was used as evidence reinforcing the reliability of the investigation's conclusions. Finally, the prosecutor presented the FBI BO profiling report, which concluded the perpetrator was almost certainly someone inside the household, familiar with the house structure, capable of moving at night without detection, and who chose the barn as a hiding place, behavior inconsistent with a stranger. The BIBO also emphasized that the sequence of burning evidence and erasing traces is commonly seen in offenders who have a direct relationship with the victim. After presenting the entire body of evidence, the prosecutor reiterated the key points: no signs of external intrusion, no evidence of anyone leaving the house, no proof supporting the theory that the victims left voluntarily, and all forensic data, timeline, witness statements, and behavioral analysis converged on a single pattern: one person within the family was the actor. The prosecutor concluded that the probable cause threshold had been fully met to issue an arrest warrant for Marla Hensley for direct involvement in the disappearance of Walter and Evelyn. After a prolonged closed-door discussion, the grand jury proceeded to vote according to procedure. A majority of members agreed that the convergence of evidence was strong enough to establish reasonable suspicion that a crime had occurred inside the Hensley home and that Marla Hensley was involved. The grand jury formally approved the arrest warrant, authorizing DCI to proceed with the arrest of Marla in accordance with Iowa state legal procedure. The warrant was signed the same day and forwarded to the Lucas County Sheriff's Office for execution. After the grand jury approved the arrest warrant, the Lucas County Sheriff's Office coordinated with DCI to implement the execution plan within 24 hours to minimize the risk of evidence tampering or the suspect leaving the area. Early the next morning, a small tactical team was dispatched to the residence where Marla Hensley was living on the outskirts of Chariton, with the goal of effecting a safe arrest without disturbing the surrounding area. The team split into two groups. One group secured the rear to prevent escape through the back door or garage. The other group approached the front door, following standard knock-and-announce procedure. When the door opened, Marla appeared alert but visibly surprised to see multiple law enforcement personnel. The arrest warrant was read aloud, clearly stating the preliminary charges related to the disappearance of Walter and Evelyn Hensley. Marla did not resist, ask questions, or immediately request an attorney. She was handcuffed according to procedure and escorted to the waiting transport vehicle. Immediately after Marla was removed, DCI secured the scene at the Hensley farm, the primary location of the original investigation. Forces were deployed to establish an expanded perimeter lockdown to prevent any individual from approaching the main house and barn area. Because prior forensic results identified the barn as a critical location, DCI prioritized sealing the entire structure. A temporary barrier of police tape and wooden stakes was erected around a radius of approximately 20 meters, while a team of forensic technicians was assigned to maintain constant supervision to prevent any unauthorized access. The barn door was secured with a numbered evidence seal, recording the time of sealing and the name of the responsible officer. All secondary access points, such as windows, vents, or loose roofing areas, were covered with specialized sealing materials to ensure nothing could be moved before the thorough survey. The forensic team also documented the barn's initial condition prior to excavation using a 360-degree photography system and noted locations that would require drilling, cutting, or object relocation during the digging phase. In addition, a scene control log was created and posted at the entrance so that every person entering or exiting had to sign, preventing errors during processing. DCI simultaneously sealed off the incinerator area behind the house, where partially burned evidence had been recovered in 1984. Although most samples had already been analyzed, the area was still protected to avoid the loss of any additional information if further comparison became necessary. A forensic support vehicle was brought in to prepare excavation equipment, including soil layer cutting tools, sifting screens, evidence containers, and portable lighting systems. All equipment remained sealed inside the vehicle until the order to begin deep survey was given. Once the sealing procedures were complete, the scene commander declared the barn and all auxiliary areas of the farm officially placed under restricted forensic zone status, absolute controlled access, with only authorized forensic personnel and investigators permitted to enter. This was a mandatory condition to ensure that future barn excavation would occur in an uncontaminated evidence environment. The arrest of Marla and the sealing of the barn marked a major turning point. For the first time since 1984, the entire farm property was treated as a criminal crime scene rather than merely a location connected to a missing persons case. No longer constrained by previous technical limitations, DCI prepared to move into the key investigative phase with the goal of clarifying what could not be accomplished 30 years earlier. Immediately after Marla Hensley's arrest and the barn sealing in preparation for excavation, DCI began the intensive interrogation phase using the Reed technique, a process designed to analyze psychological responses, cross-reference forensic data, and apply pressure to elicit truth. The interrogation took place in an interview room at Lucas County, with only the two lead investigators present to minimize distractions and maintain control of the confrontation. In the initial phase, the team employed the behavioral analysis interview, asking open-ended questions to observe Marla's reactions to non-accusatory prompts. Marla remained calm, but investigators clearly noted facial muscle tension when the barn or the 9:30 to 10:30 timeframe was mentioned, the period that the 3D simulation concluded she could not account for. When moving to the second phase of the Reed technique, investigators began theme development, presenting the agency's hypothesis in a way that minimized culpability to encourage truth-telling. One investigator suggested that the incident could have been an accident inside the house, or that someone panicked and handled it wrong. Marla remained silent, responding only briefly that she didn't know what happened. This response aligned with the team's prediction, as suspects often try to maintain a consistent story before facing technical evidence. When transitioning to the forensic confrontation phase, investigators began presenting each group of evidence in detail. First, they showed the analysis report of partially burned fabric from the incinerator, concluding the fibers matched Evelyn's coat. They asked Marla, "Do you know why your mother's coat was burned in the incinerator behind the house?" Marla replied that she did not know Evelyn had any coat that was burned, and stated she never used the incinerator. The investigators did not directly challenge her, but continued by presenting the burned polymer sample consistent with Evelyn's personal items. When asked if she had ever seen Evelyn's eyeglass case damaged or missing, Marla appeared flustered and said her mother sometimes dropped things but could not explain why those items were completely incinerated. When the investigators moved to the soil forensics evidence, Marla began shifting her sitting posture, a psychological indicator of stress. They presented soil core images and concluded the barn floor had been dug up and refilled around the time of the disappearance. Marla immediately denied it, saying she knew nothing about disturbed soil and didn't use the barn at night. The investigators did not argue, but proceeded to show the GPR data, an artificial void, exactly in the disturbed soil area, containing a high-density object. Marla went silent, looking down at the table, offering no response. The most critical step in the read technique was implemented when investigators shifted to confronting the timeline, particularly the 47 minutes between 9:30 and 10:30 that could not be explained. They presented the 3D simulation, in which all light activity, light-off times, and in-house positioning led to the conclusion that someone left the room and went to the barn during that period. When asked if she could explain why the living room lights went out at 10:30, Marla did not answer. The investigators increased pressure by confronting her with Gordon Pike's statement, emphasizing that Gordon had confirmed seeing Marla in the kitchen near 10 o'clock, a detail completely inconsistent with her 1984 statement. Marla responded by saying Gordon must have misremembered, but investigators immediately countered with Ruth Delgado's revised statement, which matched the soil report regarding mud stains and the barn area. The combination of two independent witness accounts aligning with forensic data caused Marla to lose her initial confidence. She began blinking rapidly, breathing shallowly, and avoiding eye contact with the evidence screen. At the alternative question step, the pivotal moment in the read technique, the investigators presented two possibilities. 1. It was intentional. 2. It was an accident, and you panicked, not knowing what to do. This question is not intended to find absolute truth, but to make the suspect waver and choose the option that feels less guilt-inducing. Marla did not select either option, but her reaction changed noticeably, her voice weakened, her answers became halting, and she began making inconsistent statements about not remembering clearly what she did that night. The investigators continued to press the critical point, directly confronting Marla's statements with the simulation data and forensic results, causing the narrative structure she had clung to from the beginning to become indefensible. This is a common reaction when a suspect relies on a fixed version of events, but is confronted with technical evidence that cannot be adjusted to fit. After nearly 5 hours of continuous interrogation, the pressure from repeated questioning about timeline points and empirical data caused Marla to show clear signs of breakdown. Her voice grew hoarse, her breathing became rapid, and her hands clenched tightly together under the table. The investigators moved into the breakdown window, the period in which, according to read technique, the suspect is most likely to provide truthful information if the key pressure point is correctly addressed. Without attacking or threatening, they calmly repeated the forensic data, disturbed soil directly under the barn floor, the GPR void, Evelyn's coat fibers in the incinerator, and especially the 47 minutes of unexplained movement. They asked one final question. If you didn't do it, then who could have dug up the barn floor without anyone noticing? Who knew the exact spot in the barn that couldn't be seen from the neighbors? Who knew how to burn your mother's items without leaving traces in the trash? Marla bowed her head and did not answer. The investigators let several minutes of silence pass, then spoke slowly. We are going to dig up the barn floor. We know what's down there. But we want to hear it from you first. The moment stretched heavily. Marla's eyes darted from the table to the wall and then to her hands, as if searching for something to hold on to. When the investigators again mentioned her contradictory statement about the light being turned off and confirmed Gordon had seen her in the kitchen near 10 o'clock, Marla looked up, tears beginning to flow, though her voice remained shaky and low. Her first words were not a confession but a question. If I tell you, will everything end faster? The investigators did not answer directly, only stating that her cooperation would be noted. Marla remained silent for a long while before uttering the sentence that changed the entire direction of the investigation. They are under the barn floor. The investigators immediately asked her to describe the exact location. Marla, though still trembling, began to recount in a disjointed but more consistent manner than they had expected. She said the burial location was in the western section of the barn floor, where Walter used to keep tools but later stopped using. That section had a thin layer of cement poured many years earlier, and beneath the cement, the soil was looser than the rest. When asked how she could dig when there was a cement layer, Marla explained that the cement did not cover the entire area, only a small portion, and the spot she chose was in an old, already cracked section. She used a crowbar to pry and break the cracked cement, then scooped out the soil underneath with a small shovel. The investigators asked how long it took her to dig. Marla said she didn't remember exactly, but less than an hour. This matched remarkably well with the 47-minute timeline reconstructed by the simulation software. When asked to describe the depth of the pit, Marla said approximately 2 feet, about 60 cm, which perfectly matched the GPR data. Regarding the concealment process, Marla stated that after placing the bodies without detailing the position, she refilled the soil, compacted it with the back of the shovel and her feet to avoid leaving voids, then gathered the broken cement pieces and temporarily patched them with a mixture from an old bag of cement to cover the hole. She said she did not pour new cement, so the patch didn't look nice, but since the barn was dark and rarely entered, she thought no one would notice. When asked why she chose the barn instead of another location, Marla replied that it was the only place she believed was private enough, couldn't be seen by neighbors, and was somewhere no one paid attention to for weeks at a time. When questioned about the incinerator, Marla admitted she had burned some items so they wouldn't be in the house anymore, including Evelyn's coat, some small items, and what she described as plastic from the eyeglass case. These details fully matched the forensic conclusions regarding fiber, polymer, and burned metal. When asked why she burned them, she said she didn't want anyone to see them, and asked why Evelyn didn't take them with her. Marla did not mention motive or the events leading up to the bodies being placed in the barn. She only said that everything happened faster than I thought, and I panicked. The investigators did not press for details of the preceding events, because the immediate goal was to confirm the body location and concealment method, and Marla had already provided nearly all the technical information the excavation team needed. At the conclusion of the interview session, Marla was asked to sign a written statement describing the burial location and the digging/refilling/patching process, including the distance from the barn door to the burial point, depth, position relative to wooden beams, and description of the cracked cement layer. All details matched precisely with the soil core and GPR results. DCI deemed the statement reliable because Marla described information that only the person who performed the actions could know. The interrogation ended with investigators noting the suspect had admitted the bodies were buried under the barn floor and described the digging, covering, and cement patching process with technical details that completely matched the previously collected forensic data. Immediately after, Marla confessed to the location of the bodies buried under the barn floor and provided a detailed description of the digging, filling, patching process. DCI promptly implemented a controlled excavation plan involving the forensic team, crime scene investigators, forensic anthropologists, and a legal representative from Lucas County to ensure the entire process complied with 2007 evidence collection standards. The barn was placed under absolute lockdown, with continuous video recording from 4 angles, and every participating staff member was required to sign the chain of custody log before entering the excavation area. The selected breaking point was precisely in the western floor section, the position that perfectly matched Marla's statement, soil forensics data, and GPR imagery, 1.4 meters from the wall and 0.8 meters from the load-bearing wooden beam. Before starting, the forensic team used a laser scanner to document the barn floor in its original state one final time. After completing the documentation, the breaking process began with a technician using a handheld concrete saw to cut a rectangular outline measuring 1 meter gutter 0.6 meters. This size was determined based on Marla's description of the original pit's mouth width. The cement layer cracked and separated into small pieces exactly as described. The patch had been made from reused broken old cement, resulting in an uneven surface and inconsistent color. When the first cement slab was lifted, the unmistakable smell of long compacted moist soil rose immediately, and the underlying soil appeared noticeably looser in structure compared to the surrounding original barn floor, consistent with the core sampling findings. The forensic team switched from power tools to small shovels and metal trowels to avoid damaging any potential evidence lying just beneath the surface. Excavation proceeded in layers, with each 5-7 centimeters layer collected into stainless steel trays and sifted through mesh to ensure no small evidence was missed. At approximately 30 centimeters depth, the soil began turning a darker brown and showed unnaturally compacted patches consistent with the description of a refilled pit. Digging deeper to 60 centimeters, a forensic specialist spotted a segment of cloudy white nylon protruding from beneath the soil. The team immediately halted, reported to command, and switched to fully manual excavation techniques. As soil was gently brushed aside with small trowels, the shape of the nylon bag gradually became clear. The bag was buried horizontally, rolled at one end, and tied with old, partially rotted rope. The specialist noted a rigid structure inside creating a bulging shape, likely human bones. To avoid tearing the bag, the team expanded the pit around its perimeter, then placed forensic fabric underneath before carefully lifting the entire bag to the surface. When the bag was raised, falling soil revealed a second nylon segment lying about 20 centimeters deeper and shifted approximately 15 centimeters to the south, consistent with the possibility that 2 bodies had been buried slightly apart to fit the limited space Marla had described. The team continued excavating to a total depth of 1.2 meters, matching the GPR estimate for the depth of the anomaly. The second nylon bag was handled identically, perimeter expansion, underlayment, and lifting by 2 specialists to prevent deformation. The exterior of the second bag showed localized water infiltration, making parts of the nylon more brittle, but the internal shape strongly suggested another human skeleton. Both bags were placed on the examination table, photographed with overall shots, close-ups of the knots, and surface details of the nylon, then sealed in evidence containers according to protocol. Each container received a unique identifier: Barn Primary Body Bag 01 and Barn Primary Body Bag 02, accompanied by detailed descriptions of coordinates within the barn, depth, orientation, and relative position to the wooden beams. The forensic team continued sifting the pit soil and recovered several supporting items: fragments of rotted rope, 2 small pieces of degraded fabric, and a metal fragment resembling a button. All were collected separately, placed in paper evidence bags, labeled, and sealed on site. After a final infrared light check confirmed no remaining evidence, the excavation concluded, and the pit was left undisturbed for further analysis. The 2 nylon bags containing skeletons were immediately transported to the Iowa State Forensic Laboratory, where a team of forensic anthropologists, DNA specialists, and forensic pathologists conducted a comprehensive examination following priority protocols for serious cases involving decades-long concealment. Before opening, the team photographed the exterior, documented nylon characteristics, knot style, soil compression direction, and any traces that could aid in reconstructing burial posture. When the first bag was opened inside a negative pressure chamber, the skeleton inside remained relatively well preserved, with the skull and long bones showing limited degradation thanks to the stable soil environment. Samples were taken from the femur for mitochondrial and nuclear DNA analysis. Comparison with living relatives, specifically Walter's nephew, yielded a high probability match, confirming the first skeleton as Walter Hensley. In the second nylon bag, the smaller skeleton, pelvic shape and anthropological features indicated female sex. DNA extracted from molars and humerus was compared with indirect samples from Evelyn's relatives, resulting in an exact genetic match. Thus, both skeletons were positively identified, Walter and Evelyn Hensley, the 2 individuals missing since 1984. After identity confirmation, the forensic team analyzed burial posture, an important factor in reconstructing offender behavior. Walter was buried lower, oriented horizontally along the barn's length, arms pressed tightly to the sides, legs extended but slightly angled left. This is a common position when a body is forced into a small pit, rather than one dug to human shape. Evelyn was buried about 20 centimeters higher, with legs slightly flexed and arms in a natural bent position, suggesting she was placed in afterward with less forced compression. Neither skeleton showed signs of binding, but the natural joint flexion indicated both likely died before being brought to the barn, rather than being killed on site. The team further analyzed remaining bone and tissue to determine relative time of death. Bone samples were examined for delamination, marrow decomposition patterns, mineralization levels, and environmental effects. Results showed decomposition consistent with death and burial around October 1984. No evidence of later movement. This confirmed the bodies had remained under the barn floor from the time of disappearance until excavation. Another key forensic finding concerned perimortem and postmortem trauma. Evelyn's skull showed a fine crack on the left temporal bone, not caused by soil pressure, but by direct blunt force prior to decomposition. The crack lacked radiating fragments, suggesting a blow strong enough to cause unconsciousness, but not enough to shatter the skull completely. Walter's right ribs displayed 2 sharp-edge fractures, consistent with impact from a hard object. Both injuries lacked post-mortem cracking patterns, indicating the force occurred while the victims still had circulation. The forensic team concluded that both victims were most likely attacked inside the house or very nearby, then transported to the barn for burial. When cross-referenced with the 3D modeled timeline, the forensic conclusions aligned tightly. Time of death fit within 9:30, 10:30 p.m., corresponding exactly to the 47 unexplained minutes in Marla's account. Body positions indicated the person who buried them did not dig a sufficiently large pit, relying instead on a shallow existing depression, consistent with an inexperienced individual acting quickly and in panic. The trauma locations in both victims suggested an indoor attack, aligning with evidence of no voluntary departure from the house. Additionally, there were no signs of large vehicle body transport, matching the simulation that the perpetrator walked from the house to the barn. In the summary report, forensics concluded the bodies were buried on the night of disappearance. The entire act could be performed by one person in under an hour, and the forensic data contained no contradictions with the reconstructed timeline. This chain of conclusions significantly strengthened the entire investigative file, providing the final scientific foundation to compare Marla's statements against objective evidence. The trial of Marla Hensley took place in the spring of 2008 in Lucas County Court. where the prosecution presented the full chain of evidence in a logical sequence that the jury could follow across more than 2 decades of investigation. Opening, the prosecution recapped the 1984 disappearance, asserting there was zero evidence that Walter or Evelyn had ever voluntarily left their home. Next, they presented the new forensic evidence group, partially burned fabric matching Evelyn's jacket, burned polymers and metal consistent with her personal items, and a conclusion that the burning occurred close to the time of disappearance. Then came the soil forensics report, showing the soil structure beneath the barn floor had been disturbed and refilled precisely during the week of the disappearance. Core sampling images displayed before the court clearly revealed unnatural discontinuities in soil layers, impossible from natural processes or normal agricultural activity. Moving to GPR data, the prosecution displayed radar maps confirming an artificial void at 40-60 centimeters depth, exactly matching Marla's confessed location. They emphasized that GPR, soil forensics, and the suspect's own statement all pointed to the identical spot in the barn, an alignment that could not be coincidental. The prosecution then presented the 3D timeline simulation, illustrating the 47 unexplained minutes and showing the only path consistent with forensic data led from the house to the barn. Neighboring light on-off data, Gordon Pike's revised statement, and the mud Ruth Delgado observed were all presented as evidence that activity inside the house continued later than Marla's 1984 account. The prosecution stressed that all objective data contradicted Marla's claim of going to bed early and never leaving her room. When presenting the body excavation results, the prosecution showed the 2 nylon bags containing skeletons were found precisely where Marla described, with matching depth and orientation to GPR data. DNA reports confirmed victim identities, and bone analysis showed both died on the night of October 11th and were not moved after burial. Trauma to Walter's ribs and Evelyn's temporal bone was presented as evidence of assault before transport to the barn. The prosecution concluded that every forensic detail, from burned evidence, disturbed soil, void, burial posture, to time of death, perfectly matched Marla's detailed confession during intensive interviews, and that this confession aligned point for point with previously collected data. Shifting to legal reasoning, the prosecution emphasized the complete absence of any signs of external intrusion, no second suspect, and no evidence supporting accident or voluntary departure theories. The FBI BO report was also presented, concluding the offender was highly likely someone inside the household, familiar with the victim's structure and routines, fully consistent with Marla's behavioral profile. Defense counsel attempted to argue psychological coercion in the confession, but the prosecution countered by playing interview footage showing Marla voluntarily providing technical details only the person who actually dug the pit could know. When closing arguments ended, the court went to deliberation. The 12-member jury reviewed the entire evidence chain: forensic fibers, soil, GPR, timeline simulation, witness statements, FBI profiling, and Marla's verified confession. After more than 8 hours of discussion, they returned. The jury foreman stood, holding the verdict sheet. In the hushed courtroom he read aloud, "Guilty on all counts." Marla Hensley was convicted of first-degree murder for both Walter and Evelyn Hensley. The judge imposed a sentence of life imprisonment without possibility of parole, per Iowa law, applicable at the time of trial. Following the verdict, DCI officially closed the Walter and Evelyn Hensley cold case file, concluding a 23-year investigative journey. In the final summary report, DCI noted that this was a textbook case demonstrating the power of modern forensics when applied to old files, and that persistent review, reanalysis, and data integration had solved one of Iowa's most mysterious disappearances of the 1980s. The story of the 1984 Iowa cold case, a saga spanning 23 years, resolved only through perseverance, modern forensic technology, and the unrelenting spirit of investigators, profoundly reflects many issues American society still faces today. A small family in a peaceful town like Chariton can conceal deep internal dysfunction. Neighbors may notice lights turning on and off, but fail to recognize tragedy, and a perpetrator can maintain a normal facade for decades, just as Marla Hensley lived quietly in the community, with no one suspecting. Details such as burning Evelyn's jacket in the incinerator, digging and hastily patching the barn floor with makeshift cement, or the 47 unexplained minutes in the timeline, demonstrate one crucial truth. The truth can be buried for a very long time, but objective evidence, DNA, soil forensics, 3D modeling, does not lie. The important lessons for American society today lie in the combination of community vigilance and the truth-protecting power of modern science. First, the case reminds us that domestic violence and internal family conflict, though often invisible, remain serious problems. Neighbors saw unusual light activity but took no action. In many American communities today, proactively reporting suspicious signs can save lives. Second, the case underscores the critical importance of proper evidence storage. Burned fabric fragments, incinerator ash, and soil cores that 1984 police could not exploit became the keys to solving the case in 2007. This highlights the ongoing need to invest in forensic science and investigator training so no evidence is ever dismissed. Finally, it serves as a reminder that justice sometimes takes time, but persistent effort from investigators, science, and the community can bring truth to light, even after decades of silence. Thank you for following this more than 2-decade-long investigation journey to the end. Please subscribe to the channel to join us in the next investigative stories. See you in the next video, where we continue to uncover secrets that seem buried forever but are still waiting to be brought into the light.